I'll wash your bikes for food. He said it to 120 Hells Angels standing in a Nevada parking lot. 18 years old, holes in his shoes, hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. Every person in that lot went completely silent. Not one of them laughed. Not one of them moved, because every single one of them recognized something in that boy's eyes, something most people never have the guts to show a stranger. If you've ever had to swallow your pride just to survive, this story is going to hit you somewhere deep. Subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Ethan Miller turned 18, he sat on the edge of a stripped mattress in an apartment that no longer belonged to him and counted what he had left in the world. $43 and some change. A grandfather's mechanic cloth folded in quarters tucked into the back pocket of jeans that had been washed so many times the denim had turned the color of old smoke. And a younger sister named Lily, 14 years old, asleep in the next room because she didn't know yet that the landlord was coming at noon. Ethan sat there in the silence of early morning and did not allow himself to cry. He had learned months ago that crying used up energy he couldn't afford to waste. So he sat there instead, jaw-tight, hands flat against his knees, doing the only thing he knew how to do when the world got too heavy. He made a list, not with paper. He didn't have any. He made it in his head the way his grandfather Raymond had taught him to think through engine problems, step by step, no panic, no skipping ahead. What do I have? What do I need? What's the first move? What he had was a mechanical mind that his grandfather had spent 12 years sharpening. What he needed was a job that would pay enough to keep Lily fed and find them somewhere to sleep before winter arrived in Nevada. What the first move was, he didn't know yet, but he was going to find one. That was the thing about Ethan Miller that most people never understood when they looked at him. When they saw the worn-out shoes, when they saw the secondhand clothes, when they saw the skinny teenager with shadows under his eyes and a face that had gotten old too fast. They thought they were seeing someone who had given up. They were wrong. They were looking at someone who had not yet found the door. 6 months before that morning, Thansbonnev had still carried the ordinary shape of a teenager's existence. High school, a part-time job at a gas station. Weekend afternoons in his grandfather Raymond's garage, lying on a creeper board under a 1967 Harley-Davidson Electroglide that Raymond had been slowly, lovingly, obsessively restoring for 11 years. Raymond Miller was the kind of man who believed that patience was a skill you had to practice every single day, the same way a musician practiced scales. He wasn't gentle about everything. He was a direct man, blunt when he needed to be, with hands that had been calloused by decades of work, and a laugh that came from somewhere deep and unself-conscious. But with motorcycles and with his grandson, he had infinite patience. You want to know the difference between someone who can fix things and someone who can't? Raymond had said one afternoon, not looking up from the carburetor he was cleaning. The garage smelled like motor oil and old coffee, and the radio in the corner was playing something country and soft that neither of them was really listening to. What? Ethan had asked. Someone who can't fix things gets frustrated when the machine doesn't cooperate. Someone who can fix things understands that the machine is just showing them where they haven't paid enough attention yet. Ethan had thought about it for a long time. He still thought about it. Anyone can destroy something, Raymond said that same afternoon, setting down the carburetor and looking at his grandson with the particular directness that meant he was about to say something he'd been carrying for a while. It takes patience and character to rebuild it. Ethan had nodded, not fully understanding what he was being told. He understood it now. Raymond had died of a heart attack 8 months before Ethan's 18th birthday, and that was when everything that had been wrong with James Miller, Ethan's father, stopped being hidden by the general noise of a family functioning. James Miller was not a bad man exactly. He was a weak one. He had debts he had never told anyone about, gambling, losses that went back years, loans from people who charged interest in ways that didn't appear in any legal document. When Raymond died and the garage was sold to cover some of those debts, James Miller looked at the life he'd built and the pile of consequences he'd accumulated and made the decision that broke Ethan's understanding of what a father was. He left. Not dramatically, not with a fight or a speech or even a letter. He was simply there one evening and not there the next morning, and the note he left on the kitchen table said only that he was sorry and that he hoped things would work out. He left behind 2 children, a month of unpaid rent utility bills that had been ignored for longer than that, and a truck that had been repossessed 3 days later. Ethan had stood in the kitchen holding that note for a long time. Then he folded it, put it in his pocket, and gone to wake up Lily. "I need you to trust me," he told her. She was 13 then, just barely, with Raymond's same direct eyes and a stillness that was older than her age. "We're going to be okay. Okay, but I need you to trust me." She had looked at him for a moment. "Are you going to be okay?" The question had almost broken him. "Yeah," he said, "I'm going to be fine." Yeah. The months between James Miller's disappearance and Ethan's 18th birthday were the education that no school had ever given him and no school could have prepared him for. He learned that the social services system moved slowly, that emergency assistance had waiting lists, that most landlords would not rent to an 18-year-old with no credit history and no co-signer regardless of what story he told, that a teenage boy trying to take care of his younger sister occupied a particular kind of invisible space in the world, a space where people felt sorry but not quite sorry enough to do anything concrete. He learned that most doors would close politely. A few would close hard. He learned the difference between sympathy and respect, and that the second one was the only currency that actually bought anything. He worked every job he could find or invent. He cleaned parking lots at 5 in the morning for a gas station manager who paid him under the table and looked the other way. He carried boxes for a grocery warehouse 2 evenings a week. He found a neighbor on the next street whose lawnmower had been broken for 2 seasons and spent an afternoon fixing it for $20, then spent the next 3 weeks mowing that same neighbor's lawn and 2 others on the same block. He found a bicycle with a bent wheel at the edge of a junkyard and straightened it and rode it 8 miles each direction when he needed to search for work. He did not complain, not to anyone, not even to Lily, though she watched him with those steady Raymond eyes and understood more than he thought she did. The apartment he'd been managing to hold on to through sheer will and scrambled together payments finally gave out when the landlord received a formal complaint from the building management company and discovered that the lease was technically in James Miller's name and therefore non-transferable to a minor. That was 3 weeks before Ethan's birthday. He found a woman from their church who agreed to let Lily stay in her spare room temporarily. Getting Lily settled and safe had taken everything he had left emotionally and logistically. After that, Ethan slept where he could, a cousin's couch, for a few nights, until the cousin's wife made clear that the arrangement wasn't working a shelter for a week, until he found that the curfew and rules made it impossible to keep the schedule he needed for the warehouse job. He kept moving. He kept making lists. He kept believing that somewhere out there was a door that would open. The morning of his birthday, he counted his $43 and some change and made his plan for the day. He would walk to the industrial district on the east side of town and try 3 more shops that he hadn't visited yet: an auto parts supplier, a metal fabrication company, and a small engine repair outfit that one of the parking lot guys had mentioned might be hiring. He would be at the first one when they opened. He would be polite and direct, and he would tell them what he could do, not what had happened to him. Because he had learned by now that stories of hardship made employers uncomfortable in a way that made them say no faster than anything else. He washed his face. He put on the cleanest version of the clothes he had. He folded Raymond's cloth and put it in his back pocket. He walked out into Nevada in July. The heat that particular summer was the kind that sits on your chest and makes breathing feel like a negotiation. By 9 in the morning, the air shimmered off the asphalt in long, slow waves, and by 11, the back of Ethan's shirt was soaked through. The auto parts supplier had no openings but took his name. The metal fabrication company had a sign on the door that said hiring, which turned out to mean hiring for a position that required 2 years of certified welding experience. The engine repair outfit was closed. Not temporarily, permanently. The windows were dark, and a sheet of paper taped to the glass gave a number to call if you were owed money. Ethan stood in front of that dark window for a long moment. I was not a person who allowed himself much self-pity. He'd made a decision very early in those months after his father left. That self-pity was a room he couldn't afford to walk into because he didn't trust himself to walk back out. But standing there at 11:30 in the morning, with his legs tired and his stomach empty and the heat pressing down from every direction, he felt the weight of the last 8 months settle on him in a way it hadn't in a while. He breathed through it. Hamad, the next plan. There was a diner about 2 miles north off Route 93 that he'd passed once on a borrowed bicycle. He'd noted it the way he noted everything useful as a potential something to file away. Diners sometimes needed dishwashers who could start immediately. Sometimes they needed someone to mop or carry or stock cash under the table, no paperwork. It was worth the walk. He started walking. He heard them before he saw them. The sound arrived from about a half-mile out, a deep, rolling, layered vibration that was less like noise and more like a change in pressure. Ethan had grown up around motorcycles, had spent enough time in Raymond's garage that his ear was tuned to engines, the way other people's ears were tuned to music. He knew that sound without needing to see its source. Harley-Davidsons, a lot of them. His first thought was not fear. His first thought was the involuntary automatic assessment that Raymond had built into him, the subtle differences in idle between engines that were tuned right and engines that were running a little rough, the particular harmony of a group of bikes whose riders had learned to idle together. He counted by ear somewhere between 80 and 120 before he rounded the bend in the road and the diner parking lot came into view. He stopped. The parking lot was full, edge to edge, front to back, row after row of motorcycles, mostly Harleys, some of them, so well maintained, they caught the midday sun and threw it back in slabs of chrome light. The riders were everywhere, sitting on their bikes, standing in groups, leaning against the diner's exterior wall. Some of them eating at the outdoor picnic tables that had been arranged along the side of the building. Black leather vests, patches on every one of them. Ethan recognized the patches the way he recognized the engine sound from Raymond, who had known more about motorcycle culture than most people knew about their own families, and had shared that knowledge the same way he shared everything casually and completely. Hell's Angels. Not 5, not 10, not the modest-sized group that passed through Nevada towns on summer runs. This was a full chapter gathering, maybe multiple chapters. He couldn't count them all from where he stood, but the number was somewhere around 120, possibly more. Every ordinary instinct told him to cross the road, to take the long way around, to find another diner or another approach to the afternoon's problem. People who did not know motorcycles, who had grown up with newspaper stories as their only reference point, would have turned and walked fast in the other direction. Ethan stood there. He looked at the parking lot and he thought about several things very quickly. I thought about the $43 in his pocket and what it needed to cover. He thought about Lily at Mrs. Garner's house, eating whatever Mrs. Garner put on the table, not complaining, trusting him. He thought about Raymond's hands on that Electra Glide patient and certain working a problem that had no solution yet until it did. He thought about the mechanic cloth in his back pocket. I thought about what his grandfather would have said, which was not a mystical thing, not a voice from somewhere beyond, just a clear and practical thing that Raymond would have said in his blunt, direct way. A chance is a chance. You don't get to choose the door. You just get to choose whether you knock. Ethan put his shoulders back. He walked into the parking lot. The first person who noticed him was a man sitting on the picnic table nearest the entrance, big enough that the picnic table looked undersized, with a gray beard that had been grown for years and arms that were mapped with ink from wrist to collar. He had the kind of face that had been weathered by decades of outdoor living into something that was very difficult to read, which meant you could look at it for a long time and not know whether what was behind it was amusement or hostility or something else entirely. He had a road name stitched on his vest patch, Hawk. Victor Hawk Reynolds was 54 years old, had been a Hell's Angel for 26 of those years, and had developed over those decades a very finely tuned sense for reading people who walked into spaces where they did not belong. He could identify in about 3 seconds whether someone was coming in with aggression, with bad purpose, with fear they were trying to hide, or with something he rarely encountered. Genuine need carried without apology. He watched the teenager walk across the parking lot and felt every conversation around him slow as others noticed. One by one, the ambient sounds of a large group at rest shifted into a particular quality of quiet. Not silence, just attention, collective, and focus, the way a group of people who have spent years reading their environment will all orient to the same anomaly at the same moment. The kid was young. That was the first thing. Not mid-20s young, not college-age young, actually young, 18 at a stretch, with the kind of leanness that wasn't from working out, but from not eating enough. His shoes were bad, not fashion statement bad, structurally bad with the kind of wear at the toe that meant they'd been worn every single day for too long. The jeans were clean, but had been washed into a color that was no longer quite their original shade. The shirt was pressed, which was something Hawk noticed because he had not expected it. The kid had ironed his shirt this morning. That meant something. He walked like he was fighting the urge to walk slower. That meant something too. Hawk did not say anything. He waited. He had learned years ago that the first person to speak in an ambiguous situation gave away more than they intended to. The kid stopped about 5 feet from the picnic table. He looked at Hawk directly, not the way someone looks at a person they're trying to intimidate, and not the way someone looks at a person they're afraid of. The way someone looks at a person they've decided to trust with something. He reached into his back pocket. He pulled out a folded mechanic cloth, the old kind, the cotton twill that was softer from years of use, and held it out like he was presenting credentials. Then he said it. "I'll wash your bikes for food." Victor Reynolds had been in a great many situations in his life that required him to make fast decisions in uncertain circumstances. He had navigated things considerably more complex and considerably more dangerous than this. But in all of those situations, he could not recall the last time he had been genuinely surprised. He was surprised now. Not alarmed, not amused, surprised. The kid was standing in front of 100+ Hells Angels with a piece of old cloth in his hand asking to trade labor for a meal. And the thing that made it startling is not the request. Hawk had seen people ask for things. In a lot of ways, it was the specific quality of dignity with which it was being made. The kid was not performing desperation. He was not asking for charity. He was not making himself small or trying to disappear into the moment. He was making an offer. Straight across, clean. Here's what I can do, here's what I need. Around the parking lot, conversations had fully stopped. Men who had been mid-sentence left their sentences unfinished. A group near the door of the diner had turned. Others who'd been at the far end of the lot were drifting not quickly, but with that unhurried purposefulness of people who have decided something is worth watching. Hawk looked at the cloth. He looked at the kid's face. He looked at the shoes, which told him most of what he needed to know about how long this situation had been building. He made a decision. First, Hawk said, his voice carrying in the way it did when he wasn't especially trying to project. But the surrounding quiet made everything louder. "You eat." Dum. Inside the diner, something shifted. Ethan had not expected to be let in. He'd expected a maybe or a question or possibly a firm no delivered with a minimum of ceremony. He had not expected Hawk Reynolds to stand up from that picnic table, jerk his chin toward the diner door, and walk in like the matter was settled. He followed. 2 other men came with them, a compact man with a shaved head and a bearing that suggested military or something adjacent to it, who Ethan would later learn was called Diesel, and a taller, slower-moving man with dark eyes and a stillness that Ethan recognized the way you recognize a familiar tool, the stillness of someone who was always observing, always cataloging, a man named Daniel Stone Carter. The diner went quiet when they walked in. Not because it was unusual for Hells Angels to be in a diner that was essentially currently hosting their gathering, but because the kid with them was unusual. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with a ponytail and the expression of someone who had seen a lot and stopped being easily rattled by any of it, appeared immediately. "What can I get you?" she asked Ethan directly, as if Hawk had somehow communicated that the question belonged to him. Ethan looked at the menu. He looked at it for exactly the amount of time it took him to find the cheapest item on it. "I'll have the soup and the bread, please," he said. "Water is fine." The waitress wrote it down and left. There was a beat of silence. Hawk across the booth from him said nothing, just looked at him with that weathered, difficult-to-read face. Diesel leaned back and crossed his arms. "You know who we are?" "Yes," Ethan said. "And you still walked in." "I needed work," Ethan said. "And I know motorcycles." "You know motorcycles?" Diesel repeated, not quite a question, not quite agreement. "My grandfather rebuilt them for 30 years. I worked in his garage from when I was 6. Ethan paused. "I know what I'm doing with bikes." That's not an exaggeration. Stone, who had not yet spoken, leaned forward with his elbows on the table and looked at Ethan with the particular intensity of someone running an internal calculation. "What did your grandfather ride?" "67 Electroglide, Panhead. He was restoring it when he died." "Did he finish it?" "No." Ethan's jaw tightened just slightly. "But I did." The 3 men exchanged a look that was too quick and too practiced for Ethan to fully read. But something had moved in the atmosphere of the table. Something had shifted incrementally. The soup arrived. Ethan ate it slowly, the way you eat when you're very hungry and you're determined not to show it, not quickly, not urgently, but with a control that was its own kind of statement. He ate every piece of bread. He drank all the water. He didn't ask for more. When he finished, he set his spoon down and said, "I'll start with whatever bikes you need done first." Outside, the dynamic of the parking lot had reorganized itself in the way that groups of perceptive people reorganize when something interesting has introduced itself into the day. Nobody was obviously watching, but the distribution of the crowd had shifted. Conversations had reclustered, and there was a general peripheral awareness trained on the teenager who had walked out of the diner and gone to the nearest motorcycle without any particular fanfare and begun to work. He worked the way Raymond had taught him to work. Not fast, correct. He started with a visual pass, a full circuit of the bike, looking at every surface, every joint, every chrome piece. He noted what was road dust and what was grease. He noted where the brake lever assembly had a smear that suggested a slight weep from the master cylinder. He noted the way the left turn signal mount sat at an angle that meant the bracket bolt was probably loose. I didn't start cleaning until he'd finished looking. Then he cleaned like he'd been trained to clean, which was the same way Raymond had cleaned, which was the way someone cleans when they believe the thing they're cleaning deserves the attention. Chrome first with the cloth, working the polish in small circles, not wiping back and forth, but rotating, lifting the oxidation in layers. Checking the spokes for tension by sound, a light tap with his knuckle, listening for the difference between true and flat. Moving down to the engine cases, using the edge of the cloth to get into the fin channels. Removing the accumulated grime that came from miles of highway in summer heat. He worked without stopping. He did not look around to see if anyone was watching. After about 20 minutes, a man with red hair and a thick red beard, his patch red Tommy R, appeared at the edge of his peripheral vision and stood there. Ethan kept working. "That brake lever," Tommy said finally. "Master cylinder's weeping a little," Ethan said, still cleaning. "Not bad yet, but the fluid levels probably dropped a few millimeters. Worth checking before a long ride." A pause. "You got eyes in the back of your head." "I looked it over before I started." Another pause and the particular silence of a man recalibrating something. "What about the turn signal?" "Bracket bolts loose on the left one, probably just vibration over time. Half a turn on a 5/16 should fix it." Tommy was quiet for another moment. Then he called over his shoulder in a voice that was pitched to carry without being a shout. "Yo, Stone, Martin." Daniel Stone Carter had been watching since they came outside. That was his nature. He was a watcher, a cataloger, a man who processed situations with the same systematic patience that Ethan was currently applying to the chrome on this Harley, which was one of the reasons Stone registered it so clearly. He crossed the parking lot and came to stand next to Tommy. Ethan looked up briefly, registered, the presence looked back down. "Tell me about the panhead," Stone said. Not a question, an instruction. Ethan sat back on his heels and looked at the engine for a moment, not because he needed to gather his thoughts, but because when Raymond had asked him mechanical questions, the first step was always taking a breath and being accurate rather than fast. "The panhead ran from 48 to 65, Ethan said. "Overhead valve engine. The rocker covers are what give it the name. They look like upside-down pans. The early ones had hydraulic lifters, which was new for Harley at the time. The late models had alloy heads, which ran cooler. Your 67 would actually be an early shovel head, not a pan head. The transition was 66. Stone said nothing. "The Electroglide was the first year of the electric start," Ethan continued, "which my grandfather hated because he said it was the beginning of motorcycles getting lazy. He still kick-started his even after he put the electric in." Tommy made a sound that was half laugh, involuntary. Stone's expression hadn't changed, but something behind his eyes had. "How old are you?" 18, Ethan said. "Today, actually." The words landed in a way he hadn't intended. He hadn't meant to say the second part. It came out because he was tired probably, and tired made you say things you'd otherwise keep to yourself. Tommy looked at him. "Today's your birthday." "Yeah. And you're washing bikes in a diner parking lot." Ethan picked up his cloth and started on the next spoke. "I'm working," he said. "There's a difference." The question of who Ethan Miller was and how he'd arrived in a Nevada diner parking lot on his 18th birthday with nothing but a mechanic cloth and a working knowledge of Harley-Davidson engine history moved through the gathering over the next hour, the way information moves through any tightly connected group, not announced, not broadcast, but passed from person to person in the shorthand of people who have learned to communicate efficiently. Hawk told Stone what he'd observed coming in. Stone told Diesel what Ethan had said about the motorcycles. Tommy told the group nearest the wall about the brake lever. The group nearest the wall told the group at the far tables about the birthday. And somewhere in the process of traveling from person to person, the story accumulated the particular weight that true stories accumulate when the people receiving them recognize something in them. A man named Gary with a veteran's tab above his chapter patch and 20 years of road behind him listened to the recounting and said very quietly to no one in particular, "Kid walked in here with a rag and his dignity. I've seen men walk in with everything and come with less." Nobody disagreed. Hawk came back out and found Ethan now working on his third motorcycle, moving through them with the same systematic methodology, unhurried, thorough. He stood and watched for a while. Then he said, "You're not from around here originally." "Born here," Ethan said. "But my grandfather was from outside Reno. We spent a lot of summers there." "What happened to your family?" It was a direct question. Ethan appreciated that. He was tired of the kind of concern that danced around what it was actually asking. "My grandfather died 8 months ago. My father left." He paused, still cleaning. "My sister's 14. I'm trying to keep us together." "Where's your sister now?" "A neighbor is taking her in temporarily. She's okay, she's safe." He finally looked up. "That part I handled." Hawk nodded slowly. There was something in his face that was still difficult to read, but the texture of it had changed. It was less evaluation and more something else. Something that had the quality of recognition. "You handled that first," Hawk said, "before anything else." "She's my sister," Ethan said, as if that were not a complete explanation so much as the only explanation necessary, and turned back to the chrome. Hawk stood there for another moment. Then he said, "When you finish those 3, there's about 40 more that could use attention." He paused. "We'll make sure you eat again before you go." The afternoon deepened into heat and then slowly out of it, and Ethan worked through 6 motorcycles, then 8, then 10, developing a rhythm that was less about speed and more about a quality of presence, a full attention to each bike, each detail, each small thing that was slightly wrong or slightly worn or slightly in need of care. Men stopped and watched. Some asked questions. He answered them without stopping work, which seemed to be the right instinct because the questions kept coming and the quality of the attention being paid to him kept changing. An older man named Pete, who had the particular slowness of a man who'd had a surgery in the recent past, came and sat on an overturned crate nearby and watched Ethan work on his Road King without saying anything for a long time. Then he said, "You know what you've got there? That's the original 88B, the counterbalanced version, smoother at highway speed, but the balance shaft bearings need more attention than people give them." "I know," Ethan said. "I can hear it. It's not bad yet, but it's talking." Pete looked at him for a moment. "You can hear that. My grandfather said you should be able to diagnose 80% of engine problems by sound if you know what you're listening for." "Your grandfather was right." Pete folded his arms over his chest. "Who taught him?" "His father," Ethan said, "and the Indian Motorcycle Handbook from 1952 that he kept in his shop until the pages fell out." Pete laughed, a real one from somewhere unguarded, and after that the conversation became something easy and natural, the kind of conversation that happens between 2 people who have found the particular subject on which they are genuinely compatible. Stone was nearby. He heard it. I did not say anything then, but he was building something internally, putting pieces in order, and when Ethan had worked through 12 motorcycles and the light was starting its long Nevada descent toward the mountains, and someone brought out a plate of food from the diner and set it on the picnic table without asking whether he wanted it, Stone came and sat down across from him while he ate. "Let me ask you something directly," Stone said. "Okay," Ethan said. "What do you actually need? Not today. I mean, what do you actually need for your situation to change?" Ethan looked at him. He thought about the question the way he thought about difficult mechanical problems, thoroughly, not quickly. "A real job," he said. "Steady hours, steady pay work that uses what I know how to do. Something I can build from." He paused. "I don't need anyone to fix it for me. I just need a place to stand where what I can do is worth something." Stone looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that takes in more than the words. That's a very specific answer, he said. It's the true one. Stone nodded, once. Slow. Then let's see what we can do about that, he said. And Ethan, who had not let himself hope too hard about anything in 8 months, felt something shift in his chest. Not the bright, explosive thing that hope usually pretended to be, but something quieter. Something that felt more like the first movement of a door. Stone's words stayed with Ethan for the rest of that evening, the way certain things do when you've been carrying a weight for so long that any real acknowledgement of it hits harder than you expect. Not the words themselves, they were simple enough, practical, the kind of words a man of Stone's nature would use because men like that did not dress things up. But the weight behind them. The fact that someone had looked directly at what Ethan actually needed and had not flinched or deflected or handed him a pamphlet for a social services office. He slept that night on the cot that the diner owner, a heavy-set man named Gerald, who seemed to have a long-standing relationship with the chapter and an infinite tolerance for whatever arrived in his parking lot, allowed him to use in the back storage room. Ethan had not asked for it. Hawk had arranged it in the same quiet way Hawk arranged most things, with a minimum of ceremony and a maximum of effect. Before he fell asleep, Ethan lay on his back and stared at the ceiling and ran through the list in his head. He had eaten twice today. He had worked for it both times. Nobody had given him anything without him putting something forward first, and that mattered to him in a way he would have struggled to fully explain to someone who hadn't spent 8 months watching the difference between help that honored a person and help that diminished them. What had happened in that parking lot was the first kind. He was certain of it. He thought about Stone's question. What do you actually need? He had answered it truthfully, the way Raymond had taught him to answer hard questions, not with what he wished were true, not with what would sound good, but with the precise and unornamented truth. A real job, steady hours, work that uses what I know how to do. I was still turning it over when he fell asleep, and he was turning it over again when he woke up before dawn, with the particular alertness of someone who had trained themselves not to oversleep because oversleeping cost things they couldn't afford to lose. He washed his face at the utility sink. He folded the blanket Gerald had left on the cot and placed it exactly where he'd found it. He checked that everything was as he'd found it, which was the kind of instinct Raymond had given him. You leave a place the way you'd want to find it, because that's how you demonstrate that you can be trusted in a space that isn't yours. Then he went outside. The parking lot was not empty. He had expected it to be. It was early enough that the light was still that particular gray-blue Nevada color that comes before the sun clears the mountains, and the temperature had dropped to something almost gentle after the previous day's assault. He had expected silence and empty asphalt, and maybe Gerald moving around inside behind the diner windows. Instead, Hawk was sitting on the picnic table, the same one as yesterday, same position, large hands wrapped around a coffee mug, looking at the mountains with the expression of a man who spent time every morning looking at things that required no conversation. He didn't look at Ethan when Ethan came out. He said without turning his head, "Coffee's inside." Gerald left the pot on. Ethan went inside, poured a cup, came back out. He didn't sit on the table. He leaned against the side of it, a few feet from Hawk, and they both looked at the mountains for a while without saying anything. It was Hawk who spoke first. "You know what most people would have done yesterday, walking into that parking lot?" "Not walked in," Ethan said. "Right." Hawk drank his coffee. "What made you different?" Ethan thought about it. He didn't give the easy answer, the one that would have made him sound brave or calculated. He gave the true one. "I wasn't thinking about who you were," he said. "I was thinking about what I needed to do next. And the next thing was finding work. And you were there." Hawk turned his head and looked at him for the first time since he'd come outside. Something in his expression was assessing, but it had the texture of confirmation rather than evaluation. Like a man checking a measurement he already mostly knew. "How old did you say you are?" 18. "You think like someone who's been through more than that." "I've been through more than that," Ethan said. Hawk nodded. He looked back at the mountains. "Stone wants to talk to you this morning. He's got some thoughts." He paused. "Stone doesn't talk to many people. When he does, it's worth listening." "I figured that about him yesterday," Ethan said. Hawk made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had been given more room. "Yeah," he said. "Most people do." The gathering was staying another day. There was a run scheduled for the following morning, and the logistics of moving 100-plus riders required a staging period that filled the afternoon. By 8 o'clock, the parking lot was beginning its return to life, engines being started, and listened to food coming out of the diner in steady rotations conversations, picking up where they'd been left the night before. Ethan was working on his fifth motorcycle. He'd gone back to work at first light, picking up from where he'd stopped when Stone appeared. He didn't announce himself. He simply materialized at the edge of Ethan's peripheral vision the way he had yesterday, with that quality of stillness that made him seem like he'd always been there. "You're up early," Stone said. "I had 12 left yesterday when the light went." Ethan said, not stopping. "I want to finish them." "Before what?" "Before you all leave. I said I'd wash the bikes. I didn't say I'd wash some of them." Stone stood there and watched him work for a while. Then he said, "There's a shop about 8 miles north of here. Small operation. Owner's been running it alone for about 6 years. He's at the age where he could use reliable help and hasn't found any that's worth keeping." Ethan kept working. "What kind of shop?" "Motorcycles. Mostly restoration. Some custom work. He knows what he's doing. He learned on Indian 4s in the 50s, so his foundational knowledge is old school, which means it's right." Stone paused. "His name is Frank Dawson. He doesn't suffer fools. He doesn't make promises he doesn't keep. And he doesn't give people chances they haven't earned." "Why are you telling me about him?" "Because I'm going to call him this morning and tell him about you." Ethan stopped working. He turned around and looked at Stone directly. This was the first time he'd stopped working to look at someone since he'd arrived, and Stone registered it. "Why?" Ethan asked. "Because you know what you're doing, and because you're 17 bikes into a job you said you'd do, and you showed up before sunrise to finish it." Stone's voice was level. "That's not charity. That's a referral. There's a difference." Ethan looked at him for a moment. He thought about the $43. He thought about Lily. He thought about the warehouse job and the parking lot at 5 in the morning and the dark window of the engine shop with the paper note about money owed. He thought about what it felt like to know exactly what you could do and spend months unable to find a single person willing to let you prove it. "Okay," he said. His voice was steady. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Stone said. "Go finish the bikes." The moment the thanks left his mouth and Stone walked away, Tommy materialized from somewhere to Ethan's left with 2 bottles of water and a breakfast sandwich wrapped in diner paper, which he set on the seat of the nearest motorcycle without comment. Ethan looked at it. "Don't make it weird," Tommy said. "You're working. People who are working need to eat. It's basic math." "I ate last night." "That was last night. You've been out here for 2 hours. Tommy crossed his arms. "Also, it's still your birthday for about 4 more hours. Consider it a professional courtesy." Ethan ate the sandwich. Tommy sat on the next bike over and watched him work while they talked, which was a thing Tommy did. He was a social creature, constitutionally unable to be near another person without making some form of conversation, and he had the particular gift of making conversation feel like it was just happening naturally rather than being managed. Ethan found himself talking about Raymond without entirely meaning to. Not the loss of him, not that, not yet. That was still a place too raw for casual conversation. But Raymond the mechanic, Raymond the teacher, the specific and vivid details of the garage, the way Raymond organized his tools by how often he used them rather than by type, because he said your most used tools should be closest to your hand without you having to think about it. The way he could identify engine problems by the particular quality of a smell, not just oil burning or metal overheating, but specific degradations that had specific olfactory signatures that he had cataloged over 50 years of working on engines. The way he talked to motorcycles, not out loud, not like a person with a screw loose, but with his hands, the way he'd run a palm along an engine case and pause like he was receiving information through his skin. "He sounds like my uncle," Tommy said. "My Uncle Sal. He ran a body shop in Phoenix for 30 years, never used a repair manual in his life. He said if you have to look it up, you don't know it well enough." "My grandfather said the same thing," Ethan said. "He had a whole system for how he taught me things. He'd show me once slowly with commentary. Then he'd show me again without commentary. Then he'd have me do it while he watched. Then he'd walk away and let me do it alone. He said most teaching fails because the teacher stays too long." Tommy was quiet for a moment. "Smart man." "Yeah," Ethan said, "just that." But the word had weight in it. By 10 o'clock, Ethan had worked through 9 of the remaining 12 motorcycles, and the quality of the attention the gathered men were paying him had shifted from the watchful evaluation of the previous afternoon to something more like the comfortable awareness of a group that has integrated a new presence into its operating environment. Men nodded to him when they passed. A few offered comments on the bikes. This one had a carburetor rebuilt about 6 months ago. This one's been making a noise since Albuquerque, and Ethan responded to each comment with the particular combination of focus and conversational ease that suggested he could think about two things at once. Which was when Gary, the man with the veteran's tab, who had said the quiet thing about dignity yesterday, came and stood next to him with his arms folded and watched him work for about 3 minutes in the particular silence of a man who has decided to say something and is choosing his moment. "You know what I notice about how you work," Gary said. "What?" Ethan said. "You talk to people while you're working. Most people can't do that. They either work or they talk. You do both, and neither one suffers for it." Ethan looked up briefly. "My grandfather could hold a full conversation while rebuilding a carburetor from scratch." He said the hands knowing what to do frees up the mind. "Your grandfather said a lot of things." "He had a lot to say." Gary nodded slowly. "How long ago did you lose him?" 8 months. "A beat. And your father left around the same time shortly after." Ethan's jaw moved slightly. "He didn't handle the loss well." "Some men don't." "No," Ethan agreed without bitterness in it, which Gary noticed. "Not because the bitterness wasn't there. Somewhere it had to be. 8 months and a father who left his children was not something a person processed without anger. But because Ethan had put it somewhere, it wouldn't interfere with what he was doing. That also said something. "What are you going to do with the referral Stone mentioned?" Gary asked. Ethan looked at him sideways. "News moved fast in this group. Try to earn it," he said. "That's the right answer." Gary unfolded his arms. "For what it's worth, Stone doesn't mention people to Frank Dawson. Frank's rejected every person Stone's mentioned in the past 3 years. Stone stopped mentioning people." He paused. "He mentioned you. I thought you should know that." Ethan stopped working. He looked at Gary. Gary shrugged with the air of a man who has delivered the information he meant to deliver and considers the transaction complete. "Finish your bikes," he said, and walked away. The twist came at noon. Ethan had been expecting his day to unfold in a simple direction. Finish the motorcycle speak with Stone about Frank Dawson. Find out whether the referral was real and what it would require. He had been building a plan in his head, the way he always built plans, methodically and without excessive optimism, accounting for the ways things might not work and what he would do in each of those cases. "I was on the last motorcycle when the black SUV pulled into the far end of the parking lot. He noticed it the same way he noticed most things peripherally, as part of his ongoing environmental scan, filed and categorized without interrupting what his hands were doing. Black SUV, recent model, tinted windows, the kind of vehicle that suggested either corporate money or someone who wanted to signal corporate money. Not unusual. The diner served the whole road, not just the gathering. People stopped. What was unusual was the way the SUV parked. It pulled in too fast, swung wide on the turn, and the rear corner of the vehicle made contact with a motorcycle parked at the end of the row with a sharp metal sound that cut through the ambient noise of the parking lot the way sharp sounds do. Everything went quiet. The motorcycle rocked on its stand and settled. The SUV stopped. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened and a man stepped out. I was somewhere in his mid-50s, the kind of build that suggested he had once been athletic and had accumulated the modifications of comfort and time, dressed in the business casual of someone who was very far from a business casual situation and seemed to be aware of it. He looked at the motorcycle, looked at the rear corner of his SUV, looked at the gathering of Hell's Angels now oriented in his direction with the collective attention of people who have just heard something break. And then he did the thing. He took a breath, he straightened his jacket, and he started walking towards the diner door. The silence in the parking lot became very specific. It was the silence of 100 men watching a man make a choice and collectively processing what that choice revealed about him. The man whose motorcycle had been hit, a barrel-chested man named Dale Chapter Sergeant at Arms, who had ridden that particular bike for 19 years and had opinions about it that were both numerous and deeply held, was standing 20 feet away. He said very calmly, "Did anyone see what just happened?" Ethan had seen it. He had been at the exact angle, the exact distance to have a clear and unobstructed view. He had seen the SUV swing wide. He had seen the point of contact. He had seen the man look at the motorcycle and make his calculation. He kept his hands on the last chrome piece he'd been working. The question hung in the air. Dale was looking around the parking lot without particular urgency but with absolute clarity of purpose. He wanted a witness. He knew what he'd heard. He wanted confirmation that he wasn't constructing a grievance out of sound alone. Several people had been at angles where they might have seen something. None of them had Ethan's unobstructed line of sight. Hawk was watching, not looking at Dale, not looking at the retreating businessman, looking at Ethan. Stone was watching too from across the lot with the expression of a man who has just encountered an unexpected variable in a calculation he thought he had completed. Ethan knew who the man was. That was the part that sat in his chest like a stone. Han had seen Richard Cole twice before, once at a community meeting about a zoning dispute that had affected the area around his grandfather's garage, and once on a local news segment that ran a story about a real estate development Cole had pushed through over neighborhood objections. He knew the name. He knew the money attached to it. He knew that Richard Cole had relationships with city council members and at least one county commissioner, and that his real estate company had more lawyers on retainer than most counties had judges. He also knew that he was an 18-year-old with $43 in a mechanic cloth currently dependent on a referral from a biker. He'd met yesterday trying to put together the pieces of a life that had been scattered by circumstances he hadn't chosen. He knew exactly what acknowledging what he'd seen would cost him. He kept his hands on the chrome. Dale asked again, still calm. Nobody saw anything. Hawk was still looking at Ethan, not with expectation. That was the specific thing, the thing that made this harder rather than easier. Hawk was not pressuring him. Hawk was not even signaling. He was simply watching with the face of a man who would see whatever happened next and would understand it completely. Ethan's hands stopped moving. He set down the cloth, he stood up, and he walked toward Dale. "But I saw it," Ethan said. The parking lot heard him, all of it. The acoustics of the moment, the existing quiet, the way sound carried in the dry Nevada air made the sentence land at a volume Ethan hadn't calibrated for. He'd been speaking to Dale. He'd been heard by everyone. Dale turned to face him fully. "What did you see?" His rear corner clipped the bike, the left side near the saddlebag mount. He stopped, looked at it, and kept walking. Dale nodded once. He turned toward the diner door. Richard Cole had made it about 30 feet. He heard the exchange. He slowed, stopped, turned around with the expression of a man who had hoped a problem would resolve itself in his favor and was now confronting the fact that it hadn't. He looked at Ethan. "I don't know what you think you saw, son," Cole said. His voice had the practiced ease of a man who used that register. Often the register that suggested whatever the other person had to say was not quite serious enough to warrant full engagement. But these parking lots can play tricks. "It was direct contact," Ethan said. "Left rear panel of your vehicle against the saddlebag mount. You can see the paint transfer if you look at it." Cole's eyes moved across Ethan, the shoes, the clothes, the lean frame, the age in the way that some people do when they are trying to calculate leverage. "You're what, 17, 18. You're going to stake your word against mine." "I'm not staking anything," Ethan said. "I'm telling what I saw." "And who are you exactly?" "Nobody important," Ethan said. "I'm just telling the truth." Cole took a step toward him. The practiced ease had sharpened slightly, the way a tool sharpens when it becomes a weapon. "Let me explain something to you. I know people in this town. I know people who make decisions about things like housing, like employment, like the kind of situations that affect people who are," he looked at Ethan again, "in precarious positions." The threat was elegant in its indirection. It didn't say anything specific enough to be called a threat. It said everything specific enough to be understood as one. Ethan looked at him steadily. He thought about the $43. He thought about the warehouse job. He thought about Frank Dawson and the referral that Stone had not made in 3 years until this morning. I thought about what his grandfather would have said, which he already knew, which was why he was still standing here. "I'm not choosing sides," Ethan said. "I'm not trying to cause trouble for you or anyone. I'm just telling what happened because someone asked." He paused. "You hit the motorcycle, you saw it, and you kept walking." "That's what I saw." Cole stared at him. For 5 seconds, 10 seconds, the parking lot was the loudest silence Ethan had ever stood in. Then Cole said very quietly, "You'll regret this." "Maybe," Ethan said, "but I'll know I told the truth." Mm. What happened next took about 8 minutes and had the quality of a piece of machinery engaging its components in the proper sequence, each part moving into place, not dramatically, but with the inevitability of things that were correctly designed. Cole walked back to Dale. The conversation was short and did not feature the word sorry, but it featured the word settlement and the appearance of a wallet in a conversation about the specific cost of repairing a saddlebag mount on a 2019 Road King special. The number Cole wrote on the back of a business card was higher than the repair would cost, which was the kind of math that people like Cole did instinctively when the alternative was continuing a confrontation in a parking lot full of Hell's Angels. Dale took the card without comment. Cole got in his SUV and left. The parking lot returned to its normal ambient texture in the way that bodies of water return to calm, not all at once, but settling from the outside in. Ethan went back to the last motorcycle and picked up his cloth. He had about 15 minutes of work left on it. He was going to finish it. He heard footsteps, several sets not approaching aggressively, just converging. He kept working. Gary arrived first. He didn't say anything. He stood. Tommy arrived next, and he also, unusually for Tommy, said nothing. Pete appeared from somewhere and stood with his arms crossed. Hawk came last, and when he arrived, the small cluster of men shifted slightly to include him at its natural center. Ethan kept working on the chrome. It was Hawk who finally spoke. "You knew who he was," Hawk said, not a question. "Yes." "You knew what he was threatening?" "Yes." "And you said it anyway." Ethan looked up then because the tone required it, not because he was finished. "I'm not interested in being someone who goes quiet when it's convenient," he said. "I've watched that. I know what it costs." Hawk nodded, slow. The way he did things when he was giving them weight. "Who taught you that?" Ethan turned back to the chrome. "Same person who taught me everything else," he said. Nobody spoke again for a while, but nobody left either. They stood there while Ethan finished the last motorcycle, and there was in the silence of that standing the particular quality that comes when a group of people who have collectively seen a great many things agree without saying so that they have just seen something worth witnessing. When Ethan finished and straightened up and folded the cloth and put it back in his pocket, Stone was there. He'd arrived somewhere in the last 10 minutes without Ethan noticing, which seemed to be something Stone was constitutionally capable of. "I made the call," Stone said. Ethan looked at him. "Frank Dawson. I called him this morning before." Stone gestured vaguely at the space where the confrontation had happened. "Before all of that." "What did he say?" "He said what he always says. He said the last 3 kids I sent him couldn't find the combustion chamber with a map." A pause. "I told him you finished a panhead restoration at 17. He said that was either true or it was the best lie anyone had told him in a decade, and either way he wanted to talk to you." Ethan felt something move in his chest. He kept his face still. "Where is the shop?" "North on 93, then west about a mile. White building used to be a gas station. His name's on the sign." Stone looked at him. "He's there every morning by 6:30. If you want the meeting, show up tomorrow morning. Don't be late." He considers late a complete sentence. Ethan nodded. "I'll be there." "I know you will," Stone said. He turned to go, then stopped. He looked back at Ethan with something in his expression that wasn't quite a smile. Stone's face didn't seem built for the full architecture of a smile, but was adjacent to one. "What you did with Cole," he said. "I want you to understand something. We've had people talk to us, help us, cooperate with us for a lot of reasons over the years. Money, favors, fear, occasional genuine goodwill." He paused. "What you just did, you didn't do because of any of that. You did it because it was true and because someone asked. That's a rarer thing than you'd think." Ethan didn't know what to say to that, so he said, "I just told what happened." "I know," Stone said. "That's what I mean." The rest of that afternoon had a particular quality that Ethan would remember later. Not with nostalgia exactly because he was not a nostalgic person, but with the precise clarity that comes when you understand, even while something is happening, that it is a hinge of before and after a moment, that the narrative of your life will look back at as the place where things bent. Men came and talked to him in the easy way that people talk to someone they have decided to accept. Not with ceremony, not with declaration, but with the casual inclusion that is its own form of statement. Gary talked to him about Nevada roads. Tommy talked about a bike he was building in his garage at home. Pete showed him a crack in the left cylinder fin of his Road King that a previous shop had filled with JB Weld instead of doing a proper repair, and they had a lengthy and detailed conversation about the specific failure of character that caused a mechanic to do a thing like that. A man named Reyes, who had said almost nothing to him the entire day, appeared at his shoulder while he was eating dinner and said without preamble, "What you said to Cole, that was the right thing." Then he walked away. Ethan ate dinner that evening at the long outdoor table, surrounded by men who had, in the space of 36 hours, moved from regarding him as an anomaly to regarding him as a presence they had accommodated and found acceptable. Which was not friendship exactly, he understood. It wasn't that, and he wasn't looking for that, but was something real. Something he hadn't had from adults outside of Raymond in longer than he could cleanly remember. After dinner, Hawk sat next to him, and they talked for a long time about Raymond's Electroglide, what the restoration had required, what Ethan had found when he opened the engine after Raymond died and discovered that his grandfather had been nursing a cracked case half for probably 3 seasons without mentioning it to anyone. They talked about the specific engineering compromises that defined the shovelhead era and about the particular loyalty that formed between a rider and a specific machine over decades of shared road. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, Hawk said without transition, "Your sister's situation, we're going to reach out to someone we know who runs a transitional housing program. Not a shelter, a real housing program for families. She can get a stable placement while you get yourself positioned." Ethan stopped talking. He looked at Hawk. "It's not charity," Hawk said before Ethan could say anything. "It's a resource that exists in a person who needs it. We know the woman who runs it. She's good people. She'll treat your sister right." Ethan looked at the table for a moment. He was not going to cry. He was absolutely not going to cry. He had not cried in 8 months, and he was not going to start in a Hells Angels parking lot because a man he met yesterday was telling him his sister would have somewhere safe to live. "Okay," he said. His voice was level, almost. "We'll give you the contact information before we leave tomorrow morning," Hawk said. He picked up his coffee. "Now finish your food." Ethan lay on the storage room cot for the second night in a row, staring at the ceiling, and did something he hadn't let himself do in a very long time. He didn't make a list. He just lay there and let the day settle through him, all of it, the weight and the strange grace of it, the way an ordinary search for work had walked him through a door he hadn't known existed. He thought about Stone's call to Frank Dawson. He thought about 6:30 in the morning and not being late. He thought about the white building off Route 93 that used to be a gas station. He thought about Cole's face when Ethan hadn't looked away. I thought about what his grandfather had said, not the version of it that had become a quote, a portable thing, he repeated to himself in difficult moments, but the way Raymond had actually said it, the specific afternoon, the smell of the garage around them, the way Raymond had put down the carburetor and looked at his grandson with the expression of a man who was trying to give him something that would last longer than either of them. Anyone can destroy something. It takes patience and character to rebuild it. Ethan had been thinking about that sentence as a thing that applied to machines. He understood now, lying on a storage room cot in Nevada on the second night of his 18th year, that Raymond had never been talking about machines. He closed his eyes. Tomorrow was 6:30. He had work to do. Ethan was on Route 93 before 6 in the morning. I didn't have a vehicle. He had his legs and the same worn-out shoes and the particular internal clock that Raymond had built into him over years of early garage mornings, the clock that had never once let him sleep past the time he needed to be somewhere. He'd calculated the walk at roughly an hour and 40 minutes if he kept pace, which meant leaving at 4:15 to give himself a buffer. Because Stone had said Frank Dawson considered late a complete sentence, and Ethan had decided to interpret that as meaning he needed to be early enough that the concept of late could not apply to him in any form. The contact information for the housing program was folded in his front pocket next to the $43. Hawk had pressed it into his hand that morning, a fave standing in the parking lot, while the chapter organized itself for departure engines, starting one by one in the gray pre-dawn, the sound building from individual voices into the full layered harmony that Ethan had heard from half a mile away 2 days ago, and that already felt in some way he couldn't fully articulate, like a sound connected to something that had changed in him. Hawk had not been ceremonial about it. He'd handed Ethan the folded paper and said, "Her name is Carol Marsh. Tell her I gave you the number. She'll know what that means." "Thank you," Ethan said. Hawk looked at him with the weathered face that revealed so little and somehow communicated so much. Don't thank people who are just doing what's right, he said. It makes it sound like you didn't expect it. Ethan thought about that for most of the walk up Route 93. I thought about Lily. He thought about Carol Marsh's number in his pocket. He thought about what it would feel like to call his sister and tell her that the temporary situation at Mrs. Garner's house was going to become something more stable, something with a real floor under it, something he had actually built rather than borrowed. He held that thought carefully the way you hold something fragile because he knew it wasn't real yet. The number was real. The program was real. But the call wasn't made and the meeting with Frank Dawson hadn't happened, and Ethan Miller had been in the world long enough to know that things that should work out and things that did work out were not always the same category. He kept walking. The white building came into view at 6:14. It had been a gas station once. You could still see the ghost of the canopy supports where the pumps had been, but whatever it had been before was fully subordinated now to what it currently was, which was a working shop of serious intent. The signage was simple Dawson Cycle Works. Below that in smaller letters that had been painted by hand restoration. Service, no shortcuts. That last part was a philosophy statement disguised as a service description, and Ethan recognized it as such immediately. A light was already on inside. Ethan pushed the door open at 6:17. The smell hit him before anything else. Motor oil metal, the particular compound scent of decades of mechanical work absorbed into every surface of a space. It was the smell of Raymond's garage, which meant it was the smell of the most important place in Ethan's childhood, and his body responded to it before his mind could, a loosening in his chest, a settling in his shoulders, the specific calm that comes from being in a place that matches some deep internal template. The man at the workbench did not look up. Frank Dawson was 71 years old, though he moved like a man who had not gotten around to fully accepting that, with a lean, deliberate physicality and hands that were so thoroughly calloused and stained by decades of work that they looked like they'd been built out of something other than ordinary skin. He was working on what appeared to be an early model carburetor, cleaning it with a small pick, with the complete attention of someone for whom no other thing currently existed. Ethan stood inside the door and waited. 30 seconds, a minute. Frank Dawson said without looking up, "You're 13 minutes early." "Yes, sir," Ethan said. "Most people who are early spend the extra time making noise." "You didn't." "I didn't want to interrupt what you were doing." Frank set down the pick. He turned on the stool and looked at Ethan for the first time. It was the kind of look that contained several looks within it, the quick physical assessment that anyone does, followed by a slower, more purposeful reading that started at the shoes and worked upward and arrived at Ethan's face and stayed there for a moment that had weight to it. "Daniel Carter tells me you finished a panhead restoration," he said. "By yourself, at 17. "Yes, sir." "He says you learned from your grandfather." "Yes, sir." "What was your grandfather's name?" "Raymond Miller. He had a shop outside Reno for about 20 years. Before that, he worked for a dealer in Sacramento." Frank's expression did not change exactly, but something in it shifted. "Raymond Miller. Out of Sacramento, was he with Henderson's on J Street?" Ethan blinked. "Before my time, but yes, he mentioned Henderson's." Frank was quiet for a moment. He turned back to the carburetor, then turned back again. "I met your grandfather once, 1987, a swap meet in Reno. He had a set of early knucklehead rocker covers that I wanted badly. He wouldn't sell them." "What did he say?" "He said they weren't for sale because he already knew what he was going to do with them, and it wasn't the same as what I would do with them." Frank picked up the pick again. "He was right. Most people would have taken my money." A pause. "I respected that." Ethan stood there in the particular silence of a moment that was larger than it appeared. "I have those covers," Ethan said. "They're in a storage unit with the rest of his tools. The Electra Glide they were meant for, I finished the restoration 8 months ago." Frank Dawson turned on his stool again, and this time the look on his face was something different. Still unreadable in the way that very self-contained people's faces are unreadable, but different. "Did it run?" he asked. "First kick," Ethan said. "Both times I tried it." What followed was not an interview in any formal sense. Frank Dawson didn't ask about employment history or references or where Ethan saw himself in 5 years. What he did was test him methodically and without announcing that he was doing it the way a craftsman tests materials, not to break them, but to understand their actual properties distinct from their claimed ones. He took Ethan to a motorcycle at the back of the shop, a 1971 FLH that had come in 2 weeks ago for a full restoration and had been sitting while Frank decided what order to approach it in. He told Ethan nothing about its condition or history. He said, "Tell me what you see." Ethan walked around it. He didn't touch it for the first circuit. He looked. He put his face close to the engine cases. He checked the frame joints. He ran a finger along the edge of one cylinder fin and examined what came off on his skin. He crouched and looked at the primary chain area. He stood and looked at the overall relationship of the components, the way things sat relative to each other, what was original and what had been replaced, and whether the replacements had been done with understanding or convenience. Then he talked for 4 minutes without stopping. He talked about the corrosion pattern on the left exhaust port that suggested the bike had sat in a coastal environment for a period before its current history, which would mean the internal surfaces needed specific attention beyond what a standard rebuild would address. He talked about the replacement rear fender, which was not period correct and had been fitted without the correct mounting bracket modification, creating a stress point at the left rear stay. He talked about the wiring, which had been partially replaced at some point with wire of a slightly different gauge that would create resistance issues under load. He talked about the fork seals, which were weeping just enough that they hadn't been flagged as a problem, but would be one within the year. He stopped. Frank Dawson had not moved during any of this. He had his arms crossed and his head slightly tilted, and the expression of a man whose internal calculation is running faster than his face is reporting. "The coastal corrosion," Frank said. "How did you get that from looking at the exhaust port? The oxidation pattern is inconsistent with desert or inland storage. It's diffuse rather than localized. Salt air creates a different distribution than dry heat." He paused. "My grandfather had a bike come through the shop once that had spent time in Humboldt County. He showed me the difference." "How old were you?" "9, so." Frank uncrossed his arms. He walked to the workbench, picked up a rag, and wiped his hands with the deliberate thoroughness of a man buying himself a moment to think. "I've had 3 people stone Carter sent me in the past 3 years," he said. "One knew how to change oil and thought that was the same as knowing mechanics. One knew what things were called without understanding what they did. One was genuinely talented but couldn't be in the shop for 40 minutes without needing to tell me about it." He set the rag down. "What I need is someone who understands that this work is a conversation between you and the machine always knows more than you do until you've done enough of them." "That's what my grandfather called it," Ethan said. "A conversation." Frank looked at him. "Did he?" "He said the machine will tell you everything that's wrong with it if you know how to listen. He said most mechanics don't listen, they just look." A long silence. "Trial period," Frank said. 30 days. You show up at 6:30. You don't touch anything without understanding why you're touching it. You ask questions when you don't know something, and you don't pretend when you do. At the end of 30 days, we talk about what comes next." He named a daily rate that was fair, not generous fare, and said it could convert to hourly once Ethan had demonstrated his actual pace of work. "Yes, sir," Ethan said. "Don't call me sir. Frank is fine." He turned back to the workbench. "You can start by telling me everything else you noticed about that FLH that you decided not to say because you thought you'd already said enough." Ethan almost smiled. "The ignition timing is slightly retarded. You can see it in the plug color through the port threads. And the front brake cable has been adjusted rather than replaced. One too many times, the strands at the lever end are starting to fray in a way that suggests it was installed by someone who was more interested in saving money than maintaining safety." Frank picked up the pick again. "Good," he said. "Now get started." The first week at Dawson Cycle Works was the hardest week of Ethan's professional life and the best week of his professional life simultaneously, which was a combination he understood intuitively because Raymond had warned him that the best work and the most demanding work were almost always the same work. Frank Dawson was not a cruel teacher or a harsh one, but he was an exacting one in the specific way of people who have spent 50 years refusing to accept less than correct and have lost the ability to experience the approximate as sufficient. He had a radar for shortcuts that registered somewhere deep in him before it registered consciously. He would be working on his own bench across the shop. apparently fully engaged, and he would pause and walk over to where Ethan was working and say, not unkindly but with absolute certainty, "That's not right," and wait while Ethan found the not right thing and corrected it. I was right every time. The thing was, and Ethan recognized this on the third day and felt the recognition land in his chest like something clicking into proper alignment. Frank Dawson was teaching him, not in the announced way, not with lessons and demonstrations, but in the way Raymond had taught him, which was by creating the conditions in which learning was the only available response to the demands being made. By the end of the first week, Ethan could feel himself becoming more precise. The call to Carol Marsh happened on the fourth day. Ethan made it on his lunch break, sitting in the narrow alley beside the shop with the paper from Hawk in one hand and the cheap prepaid phone he'd bought with some of the first day's wages in the other. Carol Marsh answered on the second ring and said yes before Ethan had finished explaining who he was and how he'd gotten her number. "Victor Reynolds doesn't give my number to many people," she said. Her voice was the voice of a woman who had run something important for a long time and had developed the capacity to assess a situation very quickly. "Tell me about your sister," Ethan told her. He gave it to her straight, the way he'd learned to give things straight, not dramatize, not minimize, the actual facts in the actual sequence. Lily's age, their father's departure, the temporary housing at Mrs. Garner's, the timeline, what Lily needed. Carol Marsh asked 4 questions. They were the right 4 questions, the ones that revealed she understood exactly what she was evaluating and had done this enough times to know where the real information lived. Then she said, "I have a placement that could work. It's with a woman who has been hosting teenagers for 11 years and has 2 other kids in the house right now. She's good. Your sister would be safe and she'd be with people, not just housed." "What do I need to do?" Ethan asked. "Tell me when you can bring your sister to meet her. I'll arrange the rest." Ethan leaned his head back against the wall behind him. He closed his eyes for a moment. "This weekend, Saturday afternoon." "I'll make the call," Carol said. And Ethan Victor said, "You'd want to know that this isn't favor currency. What we do here is what we do because it's right. You don't owe anyone anything for it." Ethan's jaw was tight. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was mostly steady. "Saturday," she said. "I'll send you the address." He sat in the alley for another 3 minutes after the call ended. He wasn't doing anything. He was just sitting, letting the thing he'd been carrying in a particular tense way for 8 months loosen by 1 full degree. Then he went back inside. Frank was at the workbench. He didn't look up. "Good news or bad?" he said. Ethan looked at him. "How did you know I was on a call?" "You went outside. You only do that when it's something that matters." Frank set down his tool. "I'm guessing family." "My sister," Ethan said. "I found a stable housing placement for her." Frank nodded once, the gesture of a man who understood that certain things were complete in themselves and didn't require elaboration. "Then get back to that carburetor. The float seat isn't going to seat itself." The twist that nobody saw coming arrived at the end of the second week. Richard Cole walked through the door of Dawson Cycle Works at 10:15 on a Thursday morning. Ethan was underneath a 78 lowrider on a creeper board with his hands in the primary case when he heard the bell above the door, and the quality of Frank's silence changed, became the particular silence of a man who has looked up and registered something unexpected and is deciding in real time how to handle it. Ethan couldn't see anything from under the bike, but he could hear it. Cole's voice, unmistakable. The register of easy authority slightly modulated from when Ethan had last heard it, but the same underlying instrument. "I'm looking for the owner," Cole said. "I have a commission proposal. I'm developing a property about 12 miles north, and I want to display some vintage motorcycles in the lobby. It's a high-end residential development, so I want pieces that convey a certain—" "I don't do lobby pieces," Frank said. His voice had the specific flatness of a man who is deciding whether to say more. "I'm prepared to compensate generously," Cole said. "Very generously. 3 to 5 pieces, whatever you consider museum-quality work." "I said I don't do lobby pieces." Frank's voice was not unfriendly. It was final. "This is a working shop. The bikes I restore go back to their owners or to people who are going to ride them. I don't restore things to sit behind velvet ropes." A pause. Cole recalibrated. "Perhaps I could at least leave my card. If you change your—" "I won't," Frank said. Another pause. Longer this time. Ethan on the creeper board was completely still. "Is there another mechanic here?" Cole said. "Perhaps I could speak with—" There's one other person in the shop, Frank said. He's busy. Ethan heard footsteps. Cole walking, coming toward the back of the shop where the lowrider was on the lift, where the creeper board was visible from a certain angle. He heard Frank's footsteps too, following not quickly, with the unhurried intention of a man who knows his own space. Cole stopped. Ethan heard the pause. He heard the specific quality of a pause that contains recognition. That's Cole's voice changed. Is that, you know him? Frank said, a silence that had a texture Ethan could feel from the floor. We've met, Cole said carefully. Ethan put down the tool in his hand. He pushed the creeper board out from under the lowrider and stood up. He was wiping his hands on a shop rag when he turned around, which gave him an extra 3 seconds that he used to make sure his face was doing what he wanted it to do, which was nothing in particular. Cole was standing 8 feet away. In the daylight of the shop, his face was slightly different from how Ethan had read it in the parking lot, more complex, with something running behind his eyes that Ethan hadn't expected. It took him a moment to identify it. Cole was embarrassed. Not ashamed, that was a different and deeper thing, but embarrassed. The specific embarrassment of a man who has made a calculation in public and had it not go the way he'd expected, and who now finds himself looking at the evidence of that miscalculation standing in front of him in a shop he walked into for unrelated reasons. You work here, Cole said. Yes, Ethan said. Cole looked at him for a moment, then at Frank, then back at Ethan. His jaw moved slightly. The practiced ease was having difficulty with this particular situation. How long have you been? 2 weeks, Ethan said. Cole nodded. He seemed to be going through something internally that he was not entirely controlling. You told the truth in that parking lot, he said, and the sentence came out with a slightly different texture than anything he'd said before, less the register of easy authority and more the register of a man who is being precise because precision is costing him something. Yes, Ethan said. It put me in an uncomfortable position. I know it did. Cole looked at him for another moment. He was not accustomed to conversations that went this way. The repair to the motorcycle, he said. The amount I paid Dale, was that fair? Did it cover the actual damage? Ethan thought about it. Probably $100 over, he said. The mount itself is a straightforward fix. Something moved across Cole's face. I want to, he stopped. He started again differently. What I did in that parking lot was wrong, not the accidents happen. What I did after, when I kept walking. He looked at Ethan directly, and in that look was something that cost him. You were 18 years old, and you called it correctly, and I tried to use the fact that you had nothing to make you say nothing. He paused. That was wrong. The shop was very quiet. Frank was leaning against his bench with his arms crossed, watching this with the expression of a man who has seen a lot of things over a long career and has just added one to the list. Ethan looked at Richard Cole and said the thing that was true the same way he always said what was true. Okay, he said. I appreciate that. Cole nodded. He reached into his jacket. I still want to leave my card, he said to Frank. Not for the lobby pieces. I have a '64 Electra Glide that belonged to my father. It hasn't run in 15 years. I'd like it looked at properly. He set the card on the bench. When you have time. He looked at Ethan once more. The embarrassment had not entirely left his face, but under it was something different now. Something that might have been, Ethan thought, a small beginning. Then Cole left. Frank looked at the door for a moment after it closed. Then he looked at Ethan. You going to tell me that story? If you want to hear it, Ethan said. I'm 71 years old, Frank said, picking up his tools. I got time, he paused. But not right now. Right now, you've got a primary case to get back to. Ethan told him that evening after the shop closed while they were both cleaning up. He gave it the same way he gave everything straight, without embellishment, the facts in sequence. The parking lot, the crash, Cole walking away, the choice he'd had to make and what was at stake in it either direction. Frank listened without interrupting. When Ethan finished, he was quiet for a moment. Stone Carter knew this when he sent you to me, he said. No, it happened after he made the call. But before he told you about me. Yes, Frank nodded slowly. So he saw it happen. Yes. Another silence. Frank folded the shop rag in his hands with the methodical precision he brought to every physical action. I want to tell you something about Daniel Carter that I think is relevant, he said. Stone has been sending people to me for years. Some of them have been good mechanics. Some of them have been decent people. A few have been both. He set the rag down. He's never sent me someone he looked at the way he looked at you when he called me. I could hear it in his voice. And I've known Stone a long time. What did you hear? Ethan asked. Respect, Frank said simply. Stone Carter doesn't give that easily. He turned off the bench light. He picked up his keys. At the door he paused. 30-day trial, he said, 14 days in. He looked at Ethan with the direct, unembellished regard of a man who had spent 50 years only saying what he meant. It's not going to be 30 days. Ethan looked at him. It's going to be a job, Frank said, a real one, with real hours and real pay and real work. Because you know what you're doing, and you don't pretend otherwise, and you don't cut corners, and when someone asks you a hard question, you give them a true answer. He pushed the door open. That's not as common as it should be. He walked out. Ethan stood in the shop for a moment after the door closed. Around him, the machines Raymond had taught him to love sat in the particular quiet of a working space at rest, full of the accumulated presence of serious work of things carefully made and carefully maintained and carefully rebuilt. He put his hand on the FLH's tank. The metal was cool. I thought about what Frank had just said. Not the job part, though the job part was real and solid, and he would carry it home carefully, the way you carry something you know is fragile until you know it isn't. He thought about the rest of it. Respect. Stone Carter doesn't give that easily. He thought about the parking lot, the mechanic cloth, the $43. I thought about the word he'd used when Cole walked in and looked at him with that embarrassed, complex face and said, what he'd done was wrong. Okay. Ethan had said, okay, because that was what it was. Not forgiveness, exactly not yet. That was something that moved slowly in him. But okay, an acknowledgement that the man had said a true thing at some cost to himself and that the true thing had been received. He thought about what Raymond would have said about that. His grandfather would have said, that's how things get rebuilt. Not with grand gestures, not with monuments. With a man walking into a shop he came into for a different reason entirely and saying in front of a witness that he was wrong. One piece at a time, Ethan turned off the light. He walked out into the Nevada evening and thought about Saturday when he would take Lily to meet the woman Carol Marsh had found. He thought about what he would say to his sister when he saw her. He thought about what her face would do when she understood that the temporary was becoming something more stable, something built rather than borrowed. He walked with purpose. He had somewhere to be in the morning. He was not going to be late. Saturday came the way important days tend to come ordinary on the surface, carrying everything underneath. Ethan was up at 5. Not because he needed to be, because his body wouldn't let him stay horizontal when something this significant was scheduled. He lay there for about 4 minutes staring at the ceiling of the room. He was renting a single room above a hardware store 2 blocks from Dawson Cycle Works, $30 a week. No kitchen, shared bathroom down the hall, and the most valuable address he'd ever had because it was his, paid for by his own labor. No borrowed time in it, and then he got up and washed his face and pressed his shirt and went to get his sister. Mrs. Garner lived 22 minutes away on foot. Ethan knew because he'd walked it before. He knew the exact rhythm of the route, which blocks had cracked sidewalk that could catch a foot wrong, which intersection had a light that took too long, which stretch had a tree that dropped something slippery in summer. He knew it the way he knew the routes to every place that mattered to him currently, with a specific, granular knowledge of a person who travels everywhere on foot and learns the land the way drivers never do. Lily was waiting on the porch. She saw him coming from half a block away, and she did the thing she'd been doing since she was 4 years old, and he'd come to pick her up from anything she stood up straighter. Not a big movement, just a slight realignment of her spine, the physical language of someone who has been holding themselves together alone and can now briefly hold themselves together with someone else. He got to the porch steps and looked up at her. She looked at him the way she always looked at him. Raymond's eyes, direct and clear, reading him with the accuracy that had always made him feel both seen and accountable. You look better, she said. I have a job, he said. Her expression shifted. Not dramatically, Lily did not do dramatic, but it shifted in the way that 14-year-old faces do when they receive information they have been quietly, desperately hoping for without letting themselves say so. A real one. Real hours, real pay work that uses what I know. He paused. Frank Dawson, restoration shop. He knew Grandpa. She was quiet for a moment. Then softly, did he met him once, 1987, said he respected him. He respected. Lily looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked back at Ethan and something in her face had settled into a different configuration. Something that was not happiness. Exactly. Happiness was too simple a word for what lived in it, but was the specific quality of a weight being redistributed between two people who have been sharing it unevenly for a long time. Tell me about where we're going, she said. Ethan sat on the porch step and told her everything. Carol Marsh, the phone call, what Hawk had done and who Hawk was, and how Ethan had ended up in a diner parking lot with a mechanic cloth and what had happened after. He gave it to her straight, no protective editing, because Lily was 14 and had already demonstrated in the past 8 months that she was better served by accurate information than by a managed version of it. She listened without interrupting, which was her nature, the same way it was Raymond's nature absorbing everything before responding to any of it. When he finished, she said, "A Hell's Angel gave you the number." "Yes." "And he called her Victor." "That's his name. Everyone else calls him Hawk." She thought about that for a moment. Grandpa would have had a lot to say about that. He would have said the vest doesn't make the man. He would have said exactly that. A pause. He also would have said something about not judging a book by its chapter patch. Ethan laughed. It came out of him with a naturalness that surprised him slightly, the way laughter had been surprising him lately. Since the shop, since the work, since the gradual return of days that had forward motion to them. "That was terrible," he said. "I know," Lily said. And she smiled, and it was the first time he'd seen her smile in longer than he could precisely calculate. And it landed in him the way things land when you didn't know how much you needed them until they arrived. Carol Marsh was a woman in her early 60s who operated out of a modest office attached to a transitional housing facility on the west side, and she was, as Hawk had implicitly communicated, and Ethan had inferred from the phone call, exactly the right person for the thing she had devoted herself to doing. She had the particular quality of people who have done important work long enough to have stripped away everything performative about it. No manufactured warmth, no practiced empathy, just the genuine article, direct and steady and attentive in a way that made you feel assessed and cared for simultaneously. She shook Lily's hand first before Ethan's, which Lily noticed and which registered in her posture as appreciation. "Tell me what you need," Carol said to Lily, not to Ethan. To Lily. Lily looked at her. "I need somewhere stable enough that I can focus on school, and I need to know my brother can come see me." She paused. "And I need it to not feel like charity." Carol nodded. "First two are guaranteed. Third one?" She tilted her head. "What would make it feel like not charity to you?" Lily thought about it with the thoroughness she applied to everything. "If I can contribute something, even something small, like helping with dishes or working in a garden if there is one, something that makes me part of it instead of a guest in it." Carol said, "Margaret Holloway has a garden. It's her primary passion outside of the kids she takes in. She'll put you to work in it before the first week is out, and she will expect you to take it seriously." Lily said, "Good." Carol looked at her for a moment with an expression that Ethan read as genuine admiration, the unsentimental kind. Then she looked at Ethan. "She's going to be fine," she said. "I want you to hear that directly." Ethan nodded. His jaw was tight. "I know," he said. His voice was almost entirely steady. "You both are?" Carol said. She turned to the papers on her desk. "Let's get the details sorted." Margaret Holloway lived in a house that felt immediately like the kind of place that had been made a home by sustained and deliberate effort over a long period of time, the kind of home you could feel the intention in. She was 63, stout with gray hair, cut practically short, in the hands of someone who gardened seriously and cooked seriously and took seriously the business of making a physical space feel inhabited rather than merely occupied. She met them at the door and looked at Lily the way you look at someone you intend to know rather than someone you intend to manage. "Carol says you'll work in the garden," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Lily said. "Do you know anything about gardening?" "No," Lily said, "but I learned fast." Margaret Holloway nodded once with the decisiveness of someone making a final judgment. "Then we'll get along fine." She stepped back from the door. "Come in. I'll show you the room." Ethan stood in the living room while Margaret took Lily upstairs, and he looked at the photographs on the walls. Kids of various ages, various years, the photographic record of a woman who had been doing this for a long time, and he felt something he hadn't felt in so long. It took him a moment to name it. Safe. He felt safe. Not for himself, he hadn't had the luxury of making that a primary concern, but for Lily. He felt her safe. I was still looking at the photographs when Lily came back down. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs. She looked at him. Her eyes were very bright, but she was not going to cry because she was Raymond's granddaughter, and Raymond's granddaughter didn't cry in front of people whose opinions she cared about establishing. "It's a good room," she said. "Yeah, it has a window that faces east." She paused. "I'll get the morning light." Ethan thought about the storage room cot at the diner. He thought about the stripped mattress on his 18th birthday. He thought about the $43. "Wutim." "Good, eh?" he said, and meant it more than he could say. The weeks that followed had the particular quality of things that are quietly, incrementally becoming real. Not dramatic, not sudden. The way a repair comes together when all the components are correct and all the tolerances are met. Not with a single decisive moment, but with the accumulation of small rightnesses that add up to something whole. At Dawson's Cycle Works, Ethan moved from trial to permanent with a brevity that was characteristic of Frank Dawson. One morning, Frank simply changed the conversation from daily rates to weekly wages without announcement, as if the transition were too obvious to require marking, and Ethan accepted the change with equal lack of ceremony because both of them understood that the ceremony would have been redundant. I was good at the work. He had always known he was good at it, the way you know things about yourself that have been confirmed over years of evidence. But there is a difference between knowing and being allowed to demonstrate, and Frank Dawson's shop gave him the second thing in full measure. The FLH came apart and went back together with the kind of systematic care that Frank watched once, commented on once, and then left entirely in Ethan's hands. The coastal corrosion treatment he diagnosed on the first morning turned out to be exactly right. When the cylinders came off, they revealed internal oxidation patterns that would have caused problems within 2 riding seasons if left unaddressed. Frank mentioned this exactly once with characteristic brevity. "You were right about the coastal exposure. Good eyes. You would have caught it when the cylinders came off," Ethan said. "Yes," Frank said, "but you caught it before." He returned to his bench. The conversation was over. In Frank Dawson's vocabulary of recognition, it was a speech. The twist arrived on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after Lily moved into Margaret Holloway's house in the form of a phone call Ethan took standing outside the shop in the narrow alley that had become his designated space for calls that mattered. It was Richard Cole. "I got this number from Frank Dawson," Cole said. "He gave it to me without much enthusiasm, so I want you to know I understand you have every right to not want to have this conversation." Ethan leaned against the wall. "What conversation is it?" Cole was quiet for a moment. The particular quality of the quiet was that of a man who had prepared something and is now deciding whether the prepared version is actually what he wants to say. "I owe you something," Cole said. "Not the parking lot. That I addressed. I mean something larger." "You don't owe me anything," Ethan said. "Let me say it anyway." Another pause. "When I walked away from that motorcycle, it wasn't an accident that I didn't stop. I made a calculation, a fast one, the kind you don't think of as a choice, but absolutely is. I saw the bikes, I saw the situation, and I decided that my comfort and my convenience were worth more than owning what I'd done." He paused. "And when a teenager with holes in his shoes called me on it, I threatened him with his housing situation, which I knew was precarious because I'd seen enough to read it." His voice was level, but the levelness was clearly costing something. "That was not a small thing." Ethan said nothing. "I've been in this town for 22 years, Cole said. "I've built things here, some of them good, some of them less good when I'm being honest about it. I've used my position to make things easier for myself more times than I should have, and harder for other people more times than I should have." Another pause. "You were 18 years old and you had nothing, and I tried to use that as a weapon because you inconvenienced me." "Why are you telling me this?" Ethan asked, not hostilely, genuinely. "Because Frank Dawson told me about you," Cole said. "Not details. Frank doesn't give details. I think you know that. But he told me what you're doing and what you came from, and I've been sitting with the parking lot for 3 weeks, and I'm a man who has, in my better moments, tried to address things directly." "And in your worst moments," Ethan said. A beat. Then with something that sounded like honesty, "I walk away." Ethan processed that. "I appreciate you saying it," he said. "I meant what I said in the shop." "Okay, that was real." "I know it was," Cole said. "That's part of why I'm calling." He took a breath. The '64 Electroglide, my father's bike. I'd like you to be the one who works on it, not Frank you. Ethan straightened slightly. I'm junior to Frank in that shop by about 50 years of experience. Frank will supervise whatever he needs to supervise, Cole said. But I want you on that restoration. I'll pay whatever the shop charges. I'm not trying to do you a favor. I'm trying to hire the right person for a job that matters to me. A pause. Do you understand the difference? Ethan understood the difference. He'd understood it since the parking lot, since Hawk's words about what help looked like when it honored a person versus when it diminished them. I'll talk to Frank, Ethan said. That's all I'm asking, Cole said. After the call ended, Ethan stood in the alley for a moment. He thought about his grandfather's Electra Glide, the first one he'd restored, the one Raymond had left unfinished. He thought about the cracked case half Raymond had been nursing for 3 seasons without mentioning. He thought about what it meant to bring a machine back from neglect, to find each thing that had gone wrong and address it correctly, to return it to running condition, not approximately but genuinely. I thought about Cole's voice on the phone, the way the levelness had cost something. I thought that maybe the machine and the man were not entirely different problems. Frank listened to the account of the phone call the next morning without interrupting. He was cleaning the same carburetor he'd been working on when Ethan walked in on the first morning, which turned out to be a restoration piece for a customer's '52 Indian Chief. And he gave it the same complete attention he gave everything while Ethan talked. When Ethan finished, Frank set down the pick. What do you think? Ethan asked. I think Richard Cole is a man who has spent most of his life being successful enough that he didn't have to examine himself closely, Frank said. And I think he walked into this shop 2 weeks ago and had the experience of examining himself in front of an audience, and he didn't like what he saw. Is that enough? Ethan said. It's a beginning. Frank picked up the pick again. The question is what he does with it. A man can feel bad about a thing he did without changing the way he makes decisions. That's actually the more common outcome. And the less common outcome, Frank was quiet for a moment. The less common outcome is when the feeling of it changes something structural. When a man looks at the pattern of his choices and decides a pattern is wrong, not just the specific choice. He turned the carburetor in his hands. We'll know which one he is by watching what he does, not what he says. He wants me on his father's Electra Glide. I know, he called me before he called you. Frank looked at him. I told him you'd talk to him if you decided to and that I wouldn't pressure you either way. Ethan nodded. He also told me, Frank said with the deliberate pace of a man who is choosing the moment for a specific piece of information, that he's been trying to block a variance application for a building on the corner of 5th and Mineral, the building that houses the transitional program Carol Marsh runs. Ethan went very still. He's been opposing the renewal of the operating permit on the basis of zoning technicalities, Frank said. Nothing personal, he said, just an area he had development interests in. He set the carburetor down. He called me last night to tell me he was withdrawing the opposition. The shop was quiet. He told you, Ethan said slowly. He said I should tell you. He said he didn't want to use it as part of the conversation with you because he didn't want it to look like he was buying something. Frank's expression had the texture of a man delivering a verdict. He thought the information should come from a neutral party. Ethan sat with that, the full weight of it, Carol Marsh's program, the placement that was keeping Lily and Margaret Holloway's house with the east-facing window and the garden. The permit that had been under threat from a man who 3 weeks ago had threatened an 18-year-old with his housing situation in a parking lot. The same man who was now calling to say he was wrong. He withdrew it before he called me, Ethan said. Last night, Frank confirmed. Before. Ethan was quiet for a long time. Then he said, tell him I'll work on the Electra Glide. Frank nodded once. He picked up the pick. Goodwood, he said. Now get back to the FLH. I want those cases torqued before noon. Cole's '64 Electra Glide arrived on a flatbed on a Monday morning, and the moment it was unloaded, Ethan understood why Cole had said it mattered to him. The bike had not been ridden in 15 years, but it had been stored correctly, which meant the damage was the damage of time rather than the damage of neglect. And those were very different restoration problems. The chrome was oxidized but intact. The engine had never been opened by anyone who didn't know what they were doing, which meant the original tolerances were still discoverable rather than approximate. The leather on the seat was cracked in the way leather cracks when it dries over years, not the way it cracks when it's been mistreated. Someone had loved this motorcycle. Ethan stood in front of it for a full minute before touching it. Frank stood next to him doing the same thing, and Ethan understood that this was how Frank approached every restoration, with this same moment of looking, of receiving the machine's history before imposing anything on it. His father wrote it from 1965 to 2008, Frank said. 43 years. He put close to 200,000 miles on it. Ethan thought about that. 200,000 miles on a 44-year-old Harley. Properly maintained, Frank said. Evidently, the elder Cole understood maintenance in a way the son hasn't always applied to other things. A pause. He died in 2009. Richard's been storing the bike since. 15 years, Ethan said. It was the father's, not his. He said he didn't feel he had the right to ride it without restoring it first, and he didn't know who to trust with it. Frank looked at the bike. Until now, apparently. Ethan reached out and put his hand on the tank. Cool metal, decades of road absorbed into the steel. A man who had ridden 200,000 miles on this machine, who had trusted it with his life. On highways, Ethan had never seen who had maintained it correctly for 44 years, because he understood that the relationship between a rider and a machine was a covenant that required honoring. I thought about Raymond's Electroglide, the cracked case half, the rocker covers from 1987. The restoration Ethan had finished 8 months after Raymond died, alone in a garage that smelled like oil and old coffee, with the radio playing something country and soft that he wasn't really listening to. I know how to do this, Ethan said quietly. Not to Frank, to the motorcycle. Frank heard it anyway. I know you do, he said. He walked back to his bench. Come find me when you've finished your assessment. We'll talk through the sequence. Hawk called on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after the Electroglide arrived. Ethan almost didn't recognize the number. It was a Nevada area code, but not one he knew, and he answered with the uncertainty of someone who had learned not to assume calls were friendly. Kid, said Hawk's voice, immediately recognizable, the particular weight and texture of it. Hawk, Ethan said. Something warm moved through his chest before he could think about it. Stone wanted me to call. He's not a phone person. A pause. How are things? Ethan told him. The jum. Lily at Margaret Holloway's, the Electroglide. Cole's call. The permit withdrawal. He gave it efficiently, the way he'd learned to give updates to people who valued accuracy over performance. Hawk listened. When Ethan finished, he said, Cole withdrew the permit. Before he called me. I know, Hawk said. Carol told me. Ethan paused. You were watching. Not watching, Hawk said. Keeping an eye out. Different thing. Another pause. We don't disappear on people we've decided are worth paying attention to. Ethan sat with that. I want you to know, he said, what you did. Giving me Carol's number. What that meant. I know what it meant, Hawk said. That's why we did it. I don't know how to. You don't need to, Hawk said. His voice had the bluntness of Raymond's, the same quality of a man who had given something and didn't want the giving complicated by gratitude. You already paid it. How big? You told the truth in a parking lot when it would have been easier not to. You went to work before sunrise to finish what you said you'd do. You handled your sister before you handled yourself. A pause. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot. Ethan said nothing for a moment. Stone has something he wants you to consider, Hawk said. He's not going to push it, but he wanted me to mention it. What is it? The chapter runs a program, twice a year, for kids in situations like yours was. Not charity mentorship, real trades, real skills, real adults who show up consistently. Stone thinks you should be part of it, not as a recipient, as someone who talks to the kids about what it looks like from the other side. He paused. You'd be talking to 18-year-olds who still think there's no door. You know what that feels like from the inside. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. I thought about the $43. He thought about the mechanic cloth in his back pocket. He thought about what it had felt like to walk into that parking lot and not know a single thing about what was going to happen next, only knowing that standing still was not an option. Yes, he said. Tell Stone yes. I will, Hawk said, and there was something in the two words that wasn't quite warmth. Hawk didn't do warmth exactly, but was the specific quality of a man who has received the answer he hoped for and is satisfied with that. Hawk, Ethan said before the call could end. Yeah. The morning after the first night, when you were on the picnic table before anyone else was up, you didn't have to sit there. A pause. No, Hawk said. I didn't. Why did you? Another pause. Longer. The pause of a man who is being asked to articulate something he has not articulated before because it has not required articulation. Because some mornings, Hawk said, a kid who walked into a parking lot alone needs to wake up and find that somebody's still there. He paused. That's all it was. The call ended. Ethan stood in the alley with the phone in his hand and felt the full weight of the past 2 months move through him in a wave that had no specific emotion at its center, but contained all of them at its edges. He stood there until the wave passed. Then he went back inside. The Electroglide was waiting. He had work to do. The coal Electroglide took 11 weeks, not because it was beyond Ethan's ability, because he refused to let it be anything less than right. Frank watched the first 3 weeks without comment, then commented once, "You're doing it correctly," and after that left Ethan to it entirely, which was the highest form of professional trust Frank Dawson was constitutionally capable of extending, and which Ethan understood as such without needing it explained. He worked on it the way Raymond had worked on the 67, systematically, patiently, with the specific quality of attention that a machine earns when it has carried a man 200,000 miles and deserves to be understood rather than just repaired. Every component came off in sequence and was assessed individually before anything was decided about it. The engine cases were measured at every tolerance. The chrome was treated in stages, the oxidation removed in layers rather than all at once. Because rushing the chrome work on a bike that had been stored for 15 years would produce a surface that looked correct and wasn't. The wiring was replaced completely, not because all of it was bad, but because the sections that were bad had been integrated into the sections that weren't for long enough, that the boundary between them was no longer trustworthy. He rebuilt the carburetor himself the same way Frank had taught him, not by following a procedure, but by understanding each component's function well enough that the procedure was a confirmation of knowledge rather than a substitute for it. He found in the left cylinder a repair that had been done sometime in the early 1990s by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. A hairline crack in the fin, professionally welded, invisible, unless you were specifically looking for it, holding perfectly after 30 plus years. Ethan spent 20 minutes examining it before he understood what he was looking at. Then he sat back and thought about the elder Cole, a man he'd never met, a man who had ridden this machine for 4 decades through Nevada and wherever else the road had taken him, and thought about what it meant to maintain something correctly for that long. To keep faith with a machine the way you kept faith with anything that mattered. To repair it when it needed repairing and not pretend otherwise. I thought about the sun. He thought about the phone call and the permit and the way Cole's voice had sounded when he said the word wrong. He thought about Raymond's case, half-nursed quietly for 3 seasons, the thing Raymond hadn't mentioned to anyone because Raymond had his own version of pride that sometimes worked against him. Nobody was simple. That was the thing Ethan had learned in the months since his birthday, the thing the parking lot had started teaching him, and Frank's shop had continued, and Lily's east-facing window had confirmed. Nobody was a single thing. Cole was a man who walked away from what he'd done and a man who withdrew a permit before making the call. Hawk was a Hell's Angel who sat on a picnic table before sunrise so a kid would wake up and find someone still there. Frank Dawson was a man who said good when he meant you've earned this and let the word carry everything he didn't know how to say at volume. And Raymond Miller was a man who spent 30 years teaching his grandson the difference between repairing something and understanding it using motorcycles as the medium, because motorcycles were what he had, knowing the whole time that the real lesson was never about machines. Ethan torqued the last bolt on the primary case on a Wednesday morning in November, pushed himself upright, and stood back. The bike was done. He stood there for a moment in the specific silence of a completed thing. The silence that comes when work that required everything you had is finally finished and the shape of it is whole. Frank came over. He walked a full circuit around the bike without touching it, the same way Ethan had approached it 11 weeks ago. He looked at every surface. He crouched at the engine. He checked the chrome with his eyes the way a man checks chrome when he knows exactly what he's looking for. He straightened up. He looked at Ethan. Your grandfather would recognize this work, he said. 3 seconds of silence. Thank you, Ethan said. His voice was completely steady. He had gotten very good at keeping his voice completely steady when things hit him. Call Cole, Frank said. Tell him it's ready. Richard Cole arrived on a Friday afternoon, And whatever Ethan had anticipated about how the man would receive the finished machine, what actually happened was different enough from the anticipation that it stopped him. Cole walked in with the manner he always carried, the practiced ease, the professional bearing, and then he saw the bike, and the manner left him entirely. He stopped walking. He stood about 6 feet from the Electroglide and just looked at it. He didn't say anything for a long time, long enough that Ethan, standing to the side, began to understand that what was happening was not evaluation. Cole was not looking at the chrome or the engine or the quality of the restoration. He was looking at his father. When Cole finally spoke, his voice had a texture Ethan had not heard from him before. "I used to let me sit on it," Cole said, "when I was small, before I was old enough to understand what it was. I just thought it was the biggest, loudest, most magnificent thing in the world." He was quiet for another moment. "He never let me ride it. He said some things you keep for yourself, not because you're selfish, but because they're too important to share casually." His jaw moved. "I used to resent that when I was younger. I understand it now." Ethan said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't diminish the moment. Cole reached out and touched the tank. His hand rested there for a few seconds. Then he turned to face Ethan, and the look on his face was the most unguarded thing Ethan had seen from him. More unguarded even than the embarrassment in the shop, more unguarded than the phone call. "I have a question," Cole said, "and I want an honest answer, because that's what you give." "Okay," Ethan said. "Does it run like it should?" Ethan looked at him. "First kick," he said. "I tested it twice." Something broke open in Cole's face then briefly and was controlled almost immediately, but Ethan saw it. He saw the exact moment when a man who had been carrying 15 years of a stored machine and everything the machine represented felt the weight of it lift. "How much do I owe?" Cole said. Frank named the figure. Cole wrote the check without looking at it, which was the kind of thing men did when the money was not the point, and handed it over. Then he looked at Ethan. "I want to say something to you," he said, "directly." "Okay," Ethan said. "What you did in that parking lot, I've thought about it a great deal. Not what it cost you. What it should have cost me and didn't, because I've spent most of my life in positions where the things I do don't cost me enough." He paused. "I'm not going to stand here and tell you I'm a changed man. I don't think people change that completely or that fast. But I want you to know that you shifted something. The way you held your ground. The way you said, 'I'm not choosing sides, I'm just telling the truth.' I've repeated that sentence to myself more times in the past 3 months than I can count." Ethan looked at him steadily. "What do you do with it?" "I'm trying to figure out how to apply it," Cole said, "to the way I make decisions, to the calculations I run." He paused. "I'm a slow learner in certain areas, but I'm not stupid." "I know you're not," Ethan said. Cole extended his hand. "Thank you for the bike," he said, "and for the other thing." Ethan shook it. "The bike was the jaw," he said. "The other thing was free." Cole almost smiled. It was a real almost, not a performed one. He turned to Frank, shook his hand with equal directness, and walked out. Frank looked at the door after it closed. "That man is going to spend the next several years deciding who he actually is," he said. "I think that's right," Ethan said. "The decent outcome is that he figures it out." Frank picked up the check and looked at it. He looked at Ethan. "Half of this is yours." Ethan started to say something. "Don't," Frank said. "You did that restoration. I provided the space and the supervision and an occasional opinion. The work was yours." He set the check down and went back to his bench. "I'll have it sorted by end of week." The mentorship program met for the first time in January in a community hall on the north side of town, and Stone Carter stood in the back with his arms crossed and watched Ethan Miller stand in front of 11 teenagers and tell them the truth. Not a version of it, not a motivational version or a simplified version or the version that made the hard parts sound smaller than they were. The actual truth, with the $43 and the strip mattress and the 8 months of closed doors and the specific feeling of walking into a parking lot full of Hell's Angels with a mechanic cloth and a request that had taken everything he had to say out loud. He told it straight the way he told everything. The kids were various. Some were there because Carol Marsh had sent them. Some were there because their situation had found its way to the chapter's attention through the network of people who paid attention to the situations that most institutions managed not to see. Some were there because another kid who'd been there the previous session had told them it was worth coming. All of them had the particular quality of people who had learned to be suspicious of adults who wanted to help them, who had been failed enough times by well-meaning systems to develop a reasonable wariness of well-meaning systems, and who could detect the difference between someone performing care and someone actually present in about 30 seconds. Ethan was not performing. A girl in the second row, maybe 16, with the contained stillness of someone who had been holding everything together alone for a long time, who reminded him of Lily in a way that caught him somewhere, just below his sternum, raised her hand at the end and said, "What do you do when you ask for help and you feel like it makes you less?" The hall was quiet. Ethan thought about it the way he thought about all real questions thoroughly without rushing to the answer. "I think the feeling doesn't go away completely," he said. "I think what changes is what you do with it. You feel it and you do the thing anyway because the thing you need matters more than the feeling. And then you get to the other side and you realize the thing that actually made you less wasn't asking. It was not asking when you needed to." He paused. "My grandfather used to say that pride is only useful when it makes you work harder. When it makes you work alone, when you shouldn't be alone, it's not pride anymore. It's just expensive." The girl looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once in the way Lily nodded when she'd received something real. Stone in the back of the room uncrossed his arms. After the session, Stone came to stand next to Ethan while the room cleared. He didn't say anything immediately, which was his way. Ethan waited. "That girl in the second row," Stone said finally. "Her name is Maya. She's been in 3 foster placements in 2 years. She aged out of 1 and the other 2 didn't work." He paused. "She walked in here because she heard there was a guy who used to have nothing and wasn't going to stand up there and pretend it was easy. She told someone that," Ethan said. "She told Carol." Stone looked at him. "Carol thought you should know." Ethan thought about Maya's question, the way she'd asked it with the precision of someone who had been carrying the question for a long time and needed the exact formulation before they could release it. "Is Carol working with her?" he asked. "Yes, Margaret Holloway has a room available in February." Ethan was quiet for a moment. He thought about Lily in the east-facing window in the garden and what it had meant to have somewhere real to stand. He thought about Maya in the second row with her stillness and her precision. "Good," he said, simply, completely. Stone looked at him. "You did well in there today." "I just told what happened," Ethan said. "I know," Stone said. "That's what I mean." They stood there in the emptying hall, the two of them, in a silence that had the quality of things that don't require elaboration. And Ethan thought that a year ago he had not known this man existed, had not known Frank Dawson existed, had not known that a mechanic cloth in his back pocket and $43 and a willingness to walk into a parking lot when everything in him knew the easier choice was to cross the street. He had not known any of it could add up to this. But it had. Then spring came to Nevada with the particular suddenness of desert springs. 1 week cold and the next week transformed the light-changing quality overnight, the air losing its January edge and becoming something open and possible. Ethan noticed it the way he noticed everything environmental now, with the specific awareness of a person who spent time outdoors because outdoor was where the work was, whose relationship to weather had become practical rather than incidental. And he had moved into a 2-room apartment in February. Not much a bedroom, a living area with a kitchen alcove, a bathroom with a window that steamed up in winter. But it had a table where 2 people could sit, which meant Lily could come for dinner on Sundays, and it had a second chair that was specifically for that, and those 2 facts made the apartment the best place he had ever lived in his life. Sunday dinners had become the fixed point of the week. Lily would arrive at noon, and they would cook together. Both of them had discovered, somewhat to their mutual surprise, that cooking was a language they shared without having formally learned it, the same way they shared Raymond's directness and Raymond's patience, and Raymond's refusal to accept approximate when correct was achievable. They would cook and eat and talk about the week, and Lily would tell him about Margaret's garden, which had become one of the primary facts of her life, a thing she returned to in conversation the way people return to things that are making them more themselves. She had grown a row of tomatoes from seed that winter. 6 plants started indoors transplanted when the frost risk passed. She gave progress reports on them with the same methodical attention Ethan gave to engine assessments, which was the most Raymond thing about her, and which made his heart do something complicated every time he heard it. The third one from the left is going to be the best producer. She told him one Sunday in April with the certainty of someone reporting a fact rather than speculating. The root structure is stronger. You can tell by how it holds after watering. How do you know about root structures? He asked. Margaret, she said, she knows everything about it. She says the part you can't see tells you everything about the part you can. Ethan put down his fork. He looked at his sister. What? She said. Grandpa used to say that about engines, he said. Lily went still for a moment. Then something moved across her face that was not quite grief and not quite joy, but occupied the particular territory between them, where the people we've lost continue to live. He would have liked Margaret, she said. He would have argued with her constantly about the right way to do things, Ethan said. Yes, Lily said. That's how he liked people. They ate in the comfortable silence of people who have been through enough together that silence between them is never empty. The twist that Ethan had not seen coming arrived on a Thursday afternoon in May, delivered not by a phone call or a visitor, but by Frank Dawson, who came and stood at the end of the bench where Ethan was working and waited until Ethan looked up, which was Frank's way of signaling that what was coming was not a passing comment. Ethan put down his tool. Frank said, I want to talk to you about the shop. Something in his voice had a different weight. Not bad. Ethan had learned Frank's register well enough by now to read the difference, but significant. Okay, Ethan said. I'm 71 years old, Frank said. I've been doing this for 52 years. I'm not slowing down. I want to be clear about that. I have no intention of slowing down until I can't stand at a bench anymore. But I've been thinking about what happens to this shop after I can't stand at a bench anymore, and I've been thinking about it for a while, and I haven't had a clear answer until recently. Ethan waited. I don't have children, Frank said. I don't have family in this. What I have is this shop and the work we do in it, and the specific approach to that work that I've spent 52 years developing and refining. He looked at Ethan directly. I'm not talking about retirement. I'm talking about legacy, about whether what I've built here continues after I'm gone, or whether it gets sold to someone who will change the sign and cheapen the work. The shop was very quiet. I want to make you a partner, Frank said. Not now, not this year, probably not next year. But I want to build a structure where you become a partner in this shop on a timeline that reflects how much of it you've come to understand and how much of it is built on what you bring to it. He paused. I've talked to my lawyer. There are structures for this that protect both of us and protect the shop's integrity. The details can be worked out. He looked at Ethan steadily. But I need to know whether this is something you want. Ethan looked at him. He thought about the $43. He thought about the mechanic cloth. He thought about his grandfather's hands on the Electroglide patient and certain working a problem that had no solution yet until it did. I thought about what Frank had said on the first morning, no shortcuts. He thought about that sentence painted on the sign outside and what it meant that he had walked into this shop knowing nothing about it and had found those words waiting on the wall, the same words Raymond had lived by in a garage outside Reno for 20 years. I thought about what his grandfather would have said about this moment, and he knew exactly what Raymond would have said because Raymond had told him in the garage on an afternoon that smelled like oil and old coffee with the radio playing soft in the corner. Anyone can destroy something. It takes patience and character to rebuild it. Yes, Ethan said, this is what I want. Frank nodded once. The nod of a man whose internal calculation has reached its conclusion. Good, he said. He turned back to his bench. Then let's get to work. The chapter came through Nevada again in July. Ethan knew they were coming because Hawk had called 3 days before, the same way Hawk called, periodically brief and direct, with news that was always real rather than social. This time the news was that the summer run was passing through on a Saturday and the diner was the scheduled stop, and Stone had asked whether Ethan wanted to come by. He arrived at 11 in the morning. The parking lot looked exactly the way it had a year ago, row after row of Harleys, the gathered presence of the chapter, the ambient sounds of a large group at comfortable rest, the same diner, the same picnic tables, the same Nevada light pressing down from a sky that went on forever in every direction. But everything else was different. Ethan walked into the parking lot with his hands in his pockets, and people recognized him. And all of them, the chapter had 100+ members, and not all of them had been present at the diner a year ago, and not all of those who had been present had interacted with him directly. But enough. Gary raised a hand. Tommy appeared from somewhere and clapped him on the shoulder with the enthusiasm of a man greeting someone he'd been looking forward to seeing. Pete was sitting on an overturned crate in the same position he had occupied a year ago and nodded at Ethan with the specific economy of a man who considers a nod the appropriate volume for genuine feeling. Hawk was at the picnic table. Table, the same position, large hands, weathered face looking at the road with the expression of a man for whom looking at roads was a kind of conversation. He didn't say anything when Ethan arrived and sat across from him. He just nodded. They sat there for a moment in the easy silence of people who had earned the right to be quiet with each other. "How's Frank?" Hawk asked eventually. "Good. We're working on a 1948 Indian Chief. Customer brought it in from Colorado. It's the best piece I've worked on yet." He paused. "Frank says my cylinder work is cleaner than his now." He said it like it annoyed him. Hawk made the sound that might have been a laugh. "That's a compliment from Frank Dawson." "I know." Ethan looked at the parking lot. "He's talking about a partnership. Long term. It's real." Hawk was quiet for a moment. "You gonna take it?" "Already said yes." Another silence. "Your grandfather's shop," Hawk said. "The one outside Reno. What happened to it?" "Sold after my father left. Debts." Ethan paused. "The building's something else now. Dry cleaner, I think." "You ever go back?" "Once. To get the tools from storage." He thought about standing in front of that building with a storage unit key in his hand and the particular ache of a place that has been turned into something that doesn't remember what it was. "You can't tell it was ever a garage." Hawk nodded slowly. "But you can tell," he said, "because you carry it." The sentence landed in Ethan with the precision of something exactly right. He looked at Hawk. "Yeah," he said, "I do." "That's how it works," Hawk said. "What someone builds in you doesn't need the building to survive." They sat with that for a while. Stone appeared at the edge of the table, which was how Stone always appeared without announcement, as if he had simply always been there, and you were only now noticing. He looked at Ethan with the same assessing, cataloging steadiness he'd had from the beginning. "How's the program going?" he said. "The mentorship." "We're in the third session now. 14 kids this round." Ethan paused. "Maya got a stable placement. She's still coming to sessions, even though her situation has improved. She's starting to be someone the newer kids talk to." Something moved in Stone's face. Not a smile. The full architecture of a smile remained elusive for him, but its precursor, the thing that comes just before. "That's how it's supposed to work," he said. "I know," Ethan said. "I'm starting to understand what you were doing when you asked me." Stone looked at him. "What was I doing?" "You weren't just asking me to help kids. You were building something. A chain. Each person who comes through becomes part of how the next person gets through." He paused. "You did it with me and Frank. You knew Frank needed someone and I needed Frank, and that the two of us together would make something neither of us would make alone." Stone was quiet for a moment. "Your grandfather teach you to think like that," he said. "He taught me to look at how things are actually connected," Ethan said. "Not how they appear to be connected. The same principle." Stone nodded once, slow with the weight of a man giving a verdict that he has considered carefully. "Good mechanic," he said. "Your grandfather." "The best I've ever seen," Ethan said. "Until Frank." "High company," Stone said. "Yes," Ethan said. "It is." Besame. Lily came to the diner that afternoon. Ethan had asked her if she wanted to come, and she had said yes with the directness she brought to everything, and she arrived at 2 o'clock on Margaret Holloway's bicycle, which she had borrowed with the casual ease of someone who lives somewhere she belonged, and she walked into that parking lot without hesitation, because she was Raymond Miller's granddaughter, and Raymond Miller's granddaughter did not hesitate at doors. Tommy saw her first and said something to the group near him that made the group look over, and then there was the particular reconfiguration of a gathering that has had something new and worth paying attention to walk into it. Ethan made the introductions the way he did things, directly without ceremony. Lily Hawk, Lily Stone, Lily Gary, Tommy, Pete Rekas, a dozen others, whose names she would not remember, but whose faces she would. Lily shook each hand. She looked each person in the eye. She said clearly and without performance, "My brother told me what you did. I wanted to say thank you in person." Hawk looked at her for a moment. "He did the hard part," he said. "We just opened the door." "I know," Lily said, "but someone had to open it." Hawk looked at her with Raymond's same directness coming back at him from a 14-year-old's face, and something in his weathered expression shifted into a version of itself that Ethan had not seen before, something that was very clearly moved. "Your grandfather raised two good ones," Hawk said. Lily's jaw tightened slightly. She held it. "He raised us to tell the truth and finish what we start," she said. "Then he did his job," Hawk said. Late that evening, after the chapter had moved on and the diner parking lot had returned to its ordinary size and the sound of 100 motorcycles had faded into the Nevada distance, Ethan sat on the same picnic table where Hawk had sat that first morning a year ago, in the gray-blue light before the sun cleared the mountains. He sat there alone for a while. "I thought about the year, the specific granular reality of it, not the shape of it from a distance, but the texture of it up close. The cold walk up Route 93 in the dark, the smell of Frank's shop on the first morning, Lee's face when he told her about the housing placement, Cole's hand on his father's tank, Maya in the second row asking the question she'd been carrying the Sunday dinners with the tomato reports, the Indian chief from Colorado with his 50-year-old secrets waiting to be correctly read. I thought about all the doors that had been closed and about the one that had been opened in a parking lot by a man who had looked at a teenager with holes in his shoes and said, before anything else, before any question was asked or answered, before anything was established or proven or earned, first you eat. I thought about what those three words had contained, not just food, not just a meal on the cheapest item on the menu, but the fundamental assertion that a person's need was real and worth responding to. That dignity was not something you earned before you received it, but something you were owed simply by being a person standing in front of another person with your need visible and your hands out. I thought about what he carried now. Frank's 52 years of not cutting corners. Stone's quiet, systematic faith in connections that would take time to show their purpose. Hawk's particular understanding of what it meant to be still there in the morning. Carol's precision and directness, and the woman she'd found who grew tomatoes and gave east-facing rooms to kids who needed morning light. The elder Cole's 200,000 miles pressed into the steel of an Electroglide that now ran perfectly first kick both times. I thought about Raymond. He thought about the garage, the oil smell, the radio, the hands on the tank. He thought about the sentence that had always been about people. Anyone can destroy something. It takes patience and character to rebuild it. The Nevada sky overhead was enormous and clear, the kind of clear that only desert sky achieves, where the stars are not decoration, but presence, actual and specific, each one its own fact in the darkness. Ethan Miller sat under that sky and understood something he had not had the full language for until this moment, something that the year had been slowly building toward it, that what Raymond had given him was not the knowledge of how to fix machines. What Raymond had given him was the knowledge of how to fix anything, how to look at something broken and not flinch, how to take it apart in the right order, how to understand each component's function before deciding what it needed, how to put it back together with the tolerance that correct demanded, not the tolerance that convenient accepted, how to test it until it ran right, not until it ran well enough, how to be patient with the process and demanding of the result simultaneously, because patience and standards were not opposites. They were partners, and the combination of them was the only thing that produced work you could stand behind. He had rebuilt his life the same way, one component at a time, in the right order, without shortcuts. And what he had now, the shop, the partnership, the program, the Sunday dinners, the east-facing window, the conversations in the alley that mattered, the chain of people who had seen his worth before the world caught up, what he had now was not luck. It was not charity. It was not rescue. It was the result of a year of correct work applied with patience demanded of himself, with standards that Raymond had set and Frank had confirmed and Stone had recognized and Hawk had honored by sitting on a picnic table before sunrise so a kid would wake up and not be alone. He sat there until the stars had fully taken the sky. Then he stood up. He had a shop to open in the morning. He had a 1948 Indian chief with 60 years of stories in its steel, waiting to be understood correctly. He had 14 kids in a mentorship program who would be back in 3 weeks, and one of them had a question she hadn't asked yet, and he intended to be someone worth asking. One had a sister who grew tomatoes and reported on their root structures with the precision of a person who had learned from a woman who knew things worth knowing, that the part you can't see tells you everything about the part you can. He had a grandfather who had given him everything that mattered in a garage that smelled like oil and old coffee, in words that had been waiting all along to mean more than he'd understood at the time. He walked out of the parking lot with his hands in his pockets, and the Nevada night around him and the road ahead was not lit and not promised and not guaranteed, but it was his and he knew how to walk it, and he was not walking it alone. The boy who once said, "I'll wash your bikes for food," had become the man that everyone trusted to rebuild what mattered most. Because the greatest repairs are never the ones made on machines. They are the ones made on people, one true thing, one open door, one patient, an uncompromising act of faith. "You're here to take the last thing I have left," Ethan said, his voice flat, his eyes never leaving the bank officer's face. "I understand, but I'm asking you for one more night." The officer checked his clipboard, shifted his weight. "Mr. Walker." "One night," Ethan repeated. "That's all. If that kind of stubbornness speaks to you, if you've ever held on when everything said let go, hit subscribe and drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels." The envelope had been sitting on the workbench for 11 days. Ethan Walker knew what was inside. He didn't need to open it a second time. He'd read the words often enough that they'd stop being words and become something else, a weight that lived behind his sternum, pressing a little harder each morning when he unlocked the front door of Walker Motor Works and breathed in the smell of oil and metal and decades of his family's sweat baked into the concrete floor. Final notice of default. 60 days had become 30. 30 had become 14. And somewhere between the funeral arrangements 2 years ago and the third conversation with the bank's collections department, 14 had quietly become 3. 3 days. That was what the woman on the phone had told him on Tuesday afternoon. Her voice professionally neutral, the kind of neutral that took training to maintain when you were telling a man he was about to lose 18 years of his life. 3 business days, Mr. Walker. If the outstanding balance isn't received in full or a payment arrangement confirmed in writing, we will initiate the foreclosure process on the property and business assets. He'd thanked her. He didn't know why. Force of habit, maybe. His mother raised him to say thank you when the thing being handed to him was a disaster. Now it was Thursday night, past midnight. The kind of late that felt less like a time and more like a place somewhere between the day that had broken him and the one that hadn't started yet. Ethan stood at the center of his garage with a rag in his hands. He wasn't looking at a half-disassembled engine on the workbench that belonged to a customer who'd paid a deposit 3 weeks ago and called twice since asking when it would be ready. He'd told the man it was almost done both times. The truth was he hadn't touched it in a week. He'd been sitting with the paperwork instead, trying to find a number in the columns that wasn't there. The garage had been his father's first. Raymond Walker had opened it in 1987, the same year Ethan turned 3 years old. The sign above the bay door, Walker Motor Works, painted in block letters that his father had done by hand on a Saturday afternoon while Ethan sat on an overturned bucket and handed him tools he was too young to name, had faded and been repainted 4 times in the years since. But it was still his father's handwriting they'd used as the template each time. Some things you didn't change just because they got old. Raymond had died 8 years ago, left the shop to Ethan in a will that was 3 sentences long because Raymond Walker believed that anything worth saying could be said short. The 3rd sentence was the one Ethan kept coming back to on nights like this. "Don't let them take it, son. It was never just a shop." He'd promised, stood at his father's graveside in a suit that didn't fit, and promised the ground that he would hold on. And he had, through lean years and competitor shops opening up on the main road, through losing 2 longtime employees to bigger operations, through the slow erosion of the customer base that had kept his father comfortable and him merely surviving. He'd held on through all of that. What he hadn't been built for was Carol. His wife's name sat in his chest like a stone he'd swallowed and never been able to dislodge. Carol Walker née Hernandez, who had walked into this garage 17 years ago with a 2004 Sportster that was making a grinding sound she described as sounding like someone trying to blend gravel. He'd fixed the bike in 2 hours. It had taken him 6 months after that to work up the nerve to ask her out for coffee. She'd laughed when he finally did not unkindly and said, "Ethan, I've been waiting for you to ask me since February." It was August. They'd been married 11 months later. She was diagnosed 14 months after that. The illness moved the way those things sometimes do, quietly at first, then all at once. There were good stretches, months where the numbers looked better and they let themselves breathe, and then the numbers would shift and they would brace again. He'd never once heard her complain, not about the hospital stays, not about the treatments, not about the way the disease made her feel on the days when it was winning. What she said instead, on one of the harder nights when he'd been sitting beside her bed trying to hold his face together, was, "Promise me you'll keep the shop. Your dad's in those walls, Ethan. Don't let go of that." He'd promised her two promises now, both to people who were gone. And he was standing here tonight past midnight, alone in a garage that smelled like 60,000 hours of his life, looking at an envelope that told him he was probably going to break both of them. He sat down on the stool beside the workbench. He was tired in a way sleep didn't fix. The kind of tired that came from carrying something too heavy for too long without setting it down. He set the rag on the bench, pressed his palms against his knees, and looked at the tools hanging on the pegboard wall his father had built. He could name each one with his eyes closed, knew the weight of every handle, the feel of every grip. His father had taught him that tools were not objects, they were decisions. The decision to stay and work, the decision to refuse to leave something broken when your hands could fix it. He wondered what his father would say right now. Probably nothing. Raymond Walker was not a man who wasted words on situations that called for work. He would have picked up a tool and started somewhere. The belief always that action was its own kind of answer. But there was no tool for this. There was no wrench that adjusted debt. No socket set that reached into a bank ledger and corrected the numbers. Ethan dropped his head into his hands. He stayed like that for a while, not crying. He'd done that already in the car once on the way home from the hospital the morning where Carol passed, and he hadn't been able to do it again since some mechanism inside him that had locked up and wouldn't open, just sitting, existing, waiting for something he couldn't name. And then he heard it. The engine. He lifted his head. It was the sound of a Harley in distress. Even from inside the garage behind the closed bay doors, you could tell. There was a healthy Harley sound, that distinctive ground-shaking potato rumble that the engineers had spent decades perfecting and riders had spent those same decades falling in love with. And then there was this. This was a machine talking to the person riding it, saying something is wrong, something is very wrong, please find somewhere safe to stop. The engine was skipping, misfiring. There was a metallic rattle underneath it that Ethan's ears filed automatically under oil starvation or lower-end bearing issue, and the whole thing was running rough enough that he could feel the vibration through the concrete floor before he heard the wheels crunch into the parking lot gravel. He didn't move for a moment. He had no legal reason to open those doors tonight. He had no reason to take on another repair. He'd have to calculate against what little runway he had left. He was not a rescue service. He was a man who was 3 days away from losing everything he'd ever worked for. He heard the engine cut, silence, then boots on gravel. A knock on the side door, not the big bay door, but the smaller entry door to the left, the one that had a handwritten sign his father had taped there in 1992 that said, "Ring bell or knock loud, I'm probably under something." The sign had yellowed, the tape had been replaced twice, but it was still there. Ethan got up. I wasn't sure why. He would think about that later. Why he got up instead of staying on the stool, why his legs moved him toward the door instead of away from it. He didn't have a good answer for it then, and he wouldn't have one later. Some things you do because something in you knows to do them before your brain has finished the argument. He opened the door. The man standing outside was somewhere in his mid-60s, barrel-chested and broad-shouldered, in the way of someone who had been physically powerful once and still carried the architecture of that, though time had softened the edges. His beard was gray blonde, thick and untrimmed, the kind of beard that had stopped being a style choice years ago and just become part of the man's face. His eyes were light blue or gray. It was hard to tell in the overhead light above the door, and they were exhausted. Not road tired, the kind of exhausted that came from something heavier than miles. I was wearing a leather vest over a long-sleeved thermal shirt, and the vest had patches on it that Ethan recognized the way you recognize certain flags, not as decoration, but as identity, as statement, as something that meant this man had made choices about who he belonged to and had stood behind those choices for a long time. He wasn't wearing a helmet. His hair was pressed flat on one side from the wind. "You the mechanic," the man said. His voice was low, rough at the edges, like it had been used hard for many years. "I am," Ethan said. Shop's closed, the man said. It wasn't a question. He was stating what he could see. I know, I saw the lights and I thought. He stopped. Looked back at the parking lot, at the Harley sitting there, then back at Ethan. I don't have a lot of options right now. Ethan looked past him at the motorcycle. Even in the dim lot, he could see the oil sheen on the lower engine case, could see the front suspension sitting wrong. The fork was uneven, one leg slightly compressed in a way it shouldn't be at rest. The bike was old, but it was a good machine, or it had been. Right now, it was hurting. What happened to her, Ethan said. The man exhaled. Started going rough about 80 miles back. I thought I could push through to the next town, but the shaking got worse, and then I smelled the oil and I pulled off. Found this place on my phone. He paused. I've been riding for 30 years. I know what that smell means. Yeah, Ethan said. So do I. He looked at the man. You got somewhere to be tonight. I've got somewhere I need to get to, the man said. Whether I get there tonight or not, I don't know anymore. There was something in the way he said it. Not self-pity, just the simple statement of a man recalibrating around a new obstacle, the way people do when they've recalibrated before and learned not to panic. Come around to the bay, Ethan said. Let's get a look at her. The man's name was Ryan Cole. He told Ethan that while Ethan rolled the Harley inside the garage and got it up on the lift. Ryan said it the way people introduce themselves when they're too tired for small talk. Just the name offer flatly, like a piece of identification rather than a beginning of anything. Ethan Walker, Ethan said, and went to work. What he found under there was not good news. The primary chain tensioner had been failing for some time longer than Ryan probably knew based on the wear pattern. It had finally let go enough to cause the misfiring. The oil leak was coming from the primary chain case gasket, which had given up in sympathy, and the front suspension issue was a failed seal on the left fork that had been leaking slowly until the oil level dropped to the point where the damping was compromised. None of it was catastrophic. None of it was quick. Ethan straightened up and looked at Ryan, who had pulled a stool from beside the far wall and was sitting on it with his forearms on his knees watching. Give it to me straight, Ryan said. It's a few hours of work, Ethan said. The tensioner and gasket are the priority. Those are your running problems. The fork seal is serious, but the bike won't fall apart tonight if we address the others first. He paused. I'll need to source a couple of parts. I may have what I need in the back. Let me look. How much? Ryan said. Ethan named a number. It wasn't inflated. It was what it was. Ryan reached into the inside pocket of his vest. He pulled out a wallet that was folded, leather-creased, and worn at the corners. He opened it, looked inside. Then he looked up at Ethan with a directness that came from somewhere past embarrassment, from a place of pure, stripped-down honesty that some men only found when they were completely out of road. $47, Ryan said. Ethan said nothing. That's what I've got, Ryan said. I'm not looking for charity. I'm not going to waste your time with a story if you can't do anything with $47. But I'm going to tell you one thing. He stopped. His jaw moved. This bike needs to get somewhere. It matters more than I can explain right now. And if you can help me, I will find a way to pay you back. I don't know how, but I will. Ethan looked at the man. He looked at the Harley on the lift. I thought about the envelope on the workbench. He thought about his father's hands on the same floor showing him how to rebuild an engine when Ethan was 9 years old and his hands were too small to hold the tools properly. And his father had wrapped his big hands around Ethan's small ones and guided them and said, not for the last time, son, a mechanic is not measured by how much he charges. He's measured by how many broken things he refuses to leave broken. Put your wallet away, Ethan said. Ryan looked at him. Put it away, Ethan said again. Let me get the parts. I went to the back storage room and started pulling components. He had most of what he needed. The tensioner he'd have to fabricate. He had the raw stock and the machinery to do it. His father had been the kind of man who'd believed that if you could machine a part rather than buy one, you understood the machine better for it, and he'd passed that philosophy down like a trade secret. When he came back out with his arms full, Ryan was standing beside the lift looking at the Harley, not looking at it the way a man looks at his own vehicle. Something else, something more careful than that. Tell me about the bike, Ethan said, setting the parts down and reaching for a wrench. Ryan was quiet for a moment. It's not mine, he said. Ethan waited. It belongs to a friend, Ryan said. Belonged. He stopped on the word. Michael Dawson. We rode together for 23 years. He passed away 6 weeks ago. Ethan kept working, but he was listening with everything he had. I was sick for a while, Ryan said. Long enough that he had time to think about what he wanted. To say things while he still could. A pause. Mike's last request, not last request like a bucket list, like it was a wish, more like an instruction. He told me he wanted this bike to reach the Pacific Ocean one more time. He'd ridden it there the first time in '94 when he bought it. He said that ride was the best day of his life. Ryan's voice had dropped. He wanted the bike to make the trip again. He couldn't make it himself, so he asked me to take it there for him. Ethan set his wrench down. He looked at Ryan. Where are you coming from? Pennsylvania, Ryan said. Ethan did the math. That's about 2,700 miles, Ryan said. I'm about 240 away from the water, 240 miles from the end of a promise. And he was sitting in a garage in Bakersfield with $47 and a broken bike. Ethan picked up the wrench again. How long did you know him? He said. Since we were 19, Ryan said. We aged out of stupid together, which takes longer for some people than others. He almost smiled. It came and went quickly. He was the kind of man you only get a few of. If you're lucky, you get one. He was the reason I didn't go a road I probably would have gone otherwise. He looked at the motorcycle.